Hey there, my friend, Mr. Hex here. If you're ready to wander into the mysterious world of park ranger stories tonight, you're in the right place. Before we begin, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the unknown. The sun hung low over the treetops as I shouldered my pack and stepped onto the faded trail. The late October air held a crisp chill that hinted at the long winter ahead. As a park ranger, it was my job to patrol these remote acres, maintaining trails and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. But today felt different somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The forest was quieter than usual, hushed except for the occasional chirp of a chickadee or the dry rustle of fallen leaves underfoot. Golden aspen leaves fluttered down around me, catching the angled light. On the surface, it was a perfectly peaceful autumn day, but something felt off, like a splinter in my mind. I hiked deeper into the wilderness, following the serpentine path of the trail as it wound between towering ponderosa pines and granite boulders covered in emerald green moss. The farther I walked, the more unsettled I became. It started as just a prickling of the hairs on the back of my neck, easily dismissed. Then came the uncanny sensation of being watched, though I never saw anything when I turned to look. Twice, I thought I glimpsed a dark shape out of the corner of my eye, but when I whipped my head around, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Get it together, I chided myself. You're letting the isolation get to you. I kept walking, my boots crunching in the gravel and dry pine needles. The sinking sun slanted long shadows across the path. In the distance, a raven croaked, a melancholy sound that echoed through the wild acres. A breeze sighed through the treetops, making the leaves whisper. After a few more minutes, I rounded a bend in the trail and jerked to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. 20 yards ahead, standing as still as a statue between two aspens, was a massive gray wolf. It stared right at me with luminous yellow eyes, intelligence sparking in their depths. I felt pinned by its unblinking gaze. Wolves were incredibly rare in this area. My heart hammered against my rib cage as I took a slow step backward. I knew better than to run. The wolf watched me steadily for a long moment more. Then it silently turned and vanished into the brush, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. The prickly feeling of being observed intensified. I shook myself and quickened my pace, unnerved. The sooner I finished my patrol, the sooner I could return to the familiar comfort of the ranger station. But deep down, I sensed that I was already in far over my head, walking into something beyond my wildest imaginings. Little did I know that the strange wolf sighting was merely the first link in a chain of events that would draw me into a primal nightmare. For deep in this ancient forest, far older things than wolves lurked, and I was walking blind into their hunting grounds. The evening light was fading to a dusky blue by the time I reached Coldwater Spring, a natural cistern nestled in a sheltered glen off the main trail. The spring burbled softly, clear water welling up from between mossy rocks to gather in a shallow pool before spilling down the hillside in a series of miniature falls. It was a peaceful spot, or should have been. But as I stood catching my breath, the back of my neck continued to prickle with inexplicable unease. The forest's eerie silence magnified the sound of my own breathing and the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I sighed and knelt next to the pool to refill my canteen. As I leaned forward, something caught my eye that made me pause. A disturbance in the soft dirt at the water's edge. Tracks? Setting my canteen aside, I bent closer to study the marks. They were unlike anything I had seen before. The prints were canine in shape, like an enormous wolf, but with oddly elongated toes and wickedly hooked claws that scored deep furrows in the damp earth. A primitive shudder ran through me. Wolves didn't have claws like that. Nothing I knew of did. The size and shape of the print suggested a creature that walked on four legs, and yet the depth and definition of the claw mark seemed almost human. It made no earthly sense. As I knelt there trying to puzzle it out, a voice spoke right behind me. "You'd best be moving on, Ranger." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Whirling around, I found myself face to face with a grizzled old man in faded flannel and mud-caked boots. He leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick, watching me from beneath bushy eyebrows. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Name's Jed. Got a little cabin up the way." I exhaled heavily, trying to slow my galloping heart. "I'm Ranger Hartley. What are you doing out here, Jed?" "It's nearly dark." The old-timer squinted up at the darkening sky. Nights when the real forest comes alive. You'd best be long gone come full dark. An uneasy feeling stirred in my gut. Why is that? Jed met my gaze, a shadow passing behind his eyes. There's things that walk these woods, Ranger. Old things. They don't much like company, leastways not the human kind. He nodded at the strange tracks. If you're smart, you'll get gone before they add your tracks to the collection. I glanced back at the marks in the soil, a chill zipping down my spine. What made these? Do you know? The old man leaned heavily on his stick, mouth pressed into a grim line under his scraggly beard. For a long moment he simply stared at the tracks as if lost in some dark memory. Finally he spoke. The tribes that were here long before us called it Quiquiai, the dog man. Reckon you'd call it a shapeshifter nowadays? His gaze cut back to me. All I know is when the dog walker howls, you'd best be far away, locked up tight. Wearing a different skin don't make it any less hungry. As if on cue, a bone-chilling howl drifted through the trees, raising all the hairs on my arms. It sounded close. Jed tensed, knuckles whitening on his walking stick. That's your cue, Ranger. Get moving and don't look back. This ain't no place for you after sundown. With that, the old man turned and hobbled off into the deepening shadows, quickly vanishing between the tree trunks. I stood frozen for a long moment, skin crawling. Jed's words echoed in my head. Shapeshifter, dog walker, hungry. I didn't believe in such things, and yet I couldn't deny the wrongness of those tracks, or the atavistic terror the howl had stirred in my marrow. Suddenly I wanted nothing more than to be far away from here, tucked away safe behind the sturdy walls of the ranger station. Snatching up my canteen with shaking hands, I forced my legs into motion, almost running as I followed the path away from Coldwater Spring. But as the gloom deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted by something that had walked this forest for centuries. Night was bleeding into the sky like ink spreading across wet paper. I cursed softly as I realized how blind I was to my own surroundings, the winding path dimly illuminated by the feeble beam of my flashlight. Each tree trunk looked just like the last, and I was quickly losing all sense of direction in the shadowy maze. A twig snapped somewhere off to my left, and I froze, heart slamming into my throat. I swung the flashlight beam towards the sound, but saw only still pines and motionless shadows. Silence reigned, oppressive and absolute. Even the crickets and nightbirds had fallen quiet, as if the little creatures sensed a predator on the prowl. I walked faster, fighting the urge to break into a panicked run. Running would only draw attention. But despite my best efforts to keep calm, Jed's ominous warnings echoed relentlessly in my head. The dog walker howls, wearing a different skin don't make it any less hungry. Shapeshifter. The wind gusted, rattling the branches overhead like bones. I shuddered. Get a grip, I told myself firmly. There's no such thing as shapeshifters. You're a ranger, for God's sake. Act like one. But my resolve wavered as another otherworldly howl floated through the trees, raising goosebumps on my arms. It sounded closer this time, and I could almost swear there was a dark excitement in its rising and falling notes, like a hunter closing in on its prey. Then the howl transitioned into something else, a strangled scream that sounded horrifically human. I tell you, there is no sound on this green earth as blood-curdling as a person shrieking in mortal terror. That wail will haunt me for the rest of my days. It cut off as abruptly as it began, leaving ringing silence in its wake. I stood rooted to the spot, the flashlight beam juddering as my hands shook. There was no one else out here tonight, at least no one human. So what in God's name had made that awful screaming? I got my answer a moment later when my wandering flashlight beam glinted off something metallic a few yards off the trail. I could just make out a backpack, its straps twisted and torn as if savaged by wild animals. A scrap of blood-stained flannel clung to the shoulder strap, fluttering forlornly in the night wind. My stomach lurched and I tasted bile in the back of my throat. I didn't need to check the pack's contents to know that its owner had met a grisly fate. No one left their pack behind in a place like this, not with night coming on, not unless they couldn't carry it anymore. I backed away from the abandoned pack, a new and visceral terror gripping me. I was in far over my head, a lone human in a forest that had clearly been claimed by something else, something that didn't welcome trespassers. I needed to find shelter, however temporary, and wait for daylight. Spurred by desperation, I forged ahead, seeking a halfway defensible place to hole up for the long, dark hours ahead. Finally, I settled on a small clearing with a tumble of boulders along one edge that could serve as a windbreak. With fumbling hands, I unpacked my small tent and managed to get it set up. Then I crawled inside, zipping the flap shut behind me as if the flimsy nylon could keep out the horrors of the night. I huddled there in my sleeping bag as the hours crawled by, listening to the susurrus of the wind and the scurrying of tiny creatures beyond the tent walls. I didn't dare sleep, afraid of what might come creeping out of the darkness if I let my guard down. But as the long night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. My eyelids grew heavier and heavier, until I finally slipped into an uneasy doze haunted by yellow eyes and glinting teeth. Even in sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. Little did I know, my nightmare was only beginning. I startled awake some interminable time later to the sound of something moving in the underbrush nearby. It wasn't the small, furtive sounds of nocturnal animals foraging, but the deliberate rustle of a larger predator. The whisper of displaced air and a faint huff of breath betrayed its presence. Instantly alert, I sat up as quietly as I could, feeling my heart pound. I strained my ears, praying to hear the padding footfalls retreat back the way they came. No such luck. Instead, the footsteps grew louder and more distinct, circling my little clearing like a shark circling prey. Grasping for a potential weapon, I closed my shaking fingers around my heavy maglite. The metal was cold and solid in my palm, the weight of it marginally reassuring. My other hand crept towards my belt, seeking the comforting handle of my hunting knife. My fingers brushed bare nylon where the sheath should have been. I looked down sharply and my stomach dropped into my boots. The knife was gone, the empty sheath suggesting it had been deliberately removed rather than falling out on its own. A soft, mocking chuckle sounded from just beyond the tan walls, making the hairs on my nape prickle. There was dark amusement in that laugh, and an awful, creeping familiarity. But that wasn't possible, was it? No human could have gotten that close without me hearing. "Looking for this?" a sibilant voice inquired. A shape emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim moonlight filtering through the pines. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The figure was twisted and angular, half crouched in a way that was distinctly inhuman. Then the light glinted off a pair of yellow eyes and I recoiled in horror. The creature looked like the unnatural offspring of a wolf and a man. It prowled on 4 legs, but its limbs were too long, its torso too upright. Shaggy gray fur sprouted from a barrel chest and rangy muscular legs ended in huge paws tipped with wickedly curved claws. But its eyes, God help me, its eyes held a terrifying human intelligence. "What's the matter, Ranger?" it said in a gravelly, rasping voice. "Never seen a dog walker before?" It grinned, revealing a muzzle bristling with jagged yellow fangs. Clamped between those teeth, glinting in the moonlight, was the blade of my hunting knife. As I watched in mute horror, the creature tilted its head back and opened its jaws. My knife slid from its mouth and thudded to the forest floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This close I could smell the creature, a noxious reek of damp fur and old blood and something else. Something earthy and primeval that set my nerves jangling with atavistic terror. "Didn't your parents ever tell you not to talk to strangers, boy?" it growled. Its voice changed, dropping into a perfect mimicry of Jed's. "Especially not the kind that wear a different skin." It laughed again, a barking, coughing sound that sent icy fingers dragging down my spine. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for my life, but my throat was locked up tight. "Why so quiet?" the dog walker mocked. "You were making plenty of noise crashing around out here, bumbling into business that ain't yours." Its yellow eyes glittered with malice. "This forest belongs to me, Ranger boy, has for a long time, and I don't much like trespassers." Slowly, with the exaggerated care of a predator savoring the moment before the kill, the creature stalked closer. I smelled its carrion breath, felt the heat radiating from its massive body. I knew I should run, or fight, or do something. But I was frozen in place, limbs turned to lead. It leaned in until its muzzle was inches from my face, lupine eyes boring into mine. When it spoke again, it was in a chillingly urbane, almost pleasant tone. "But perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. You seem like a decent sort for a human, so I'll give you a chance. Run, little Ranger. Run as fast and far as you can. Give me a proper hunt. I do love a good chase. With that, the creature stepped back with a flourish, gesturing towards the dark forest with one huge paw. Better hurry now. It'll be more fun for me if you have a head start. Some primal instinct kicked in then, sending a jolt of fight or flight adrenaline surging through my veins. I scrambled backwards out of the tent, clumsy with terror. The dog walker watched me with a toothy grin, eyes alight with anticipation. I turned and ran into the waiting trees, its mocking laughter echoing in my ears. The hunt was on. Crashing through the underbrush, I fled blindly, caring only for putting distance between myself and the horrific creature stalking me. Branches slapped at my face and tore at my clothes as I blundered between the trees, my panicked gasps joining the night chorus of crickets and frogs. The gibbous moon cast more shadows than light, transforming the forest into a treacherous monochromatic maze. Twisted shapes loomed out of the darkness. Tree trunks and bushes contorted into menacing forms by the play of moonlight and my own imagination. But I knew the real monster wasn't a figment of an overactive mind. It was out there, coming for me. I had no idea which direction I was running, and it didn't matter. There was nowhere to go, no help to be had. There was nowhere to go, no help to be had. I was alone in this god-forsaken wilderness, pursued by a creature that defied rational explanation. All I could do was keep moving and pray that I could somehow outpace the tireless thing hunting me. But even as I ran, I knew it was hopeless. The dog walker was toying with me, letting me exhaust myself in a futile attempt to escape. I could feel its presence out there in the night, an ancient, malevolent awareness that watched me with cruel amusement. It could have taken me at any time, but it wanted to prolong the game, to savor my growing despair. My foot caught on a protruding root and I went sprawling, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs. For a moment I just lay there gasping, tasting coppery blood where I'd bitten my tongue. "Get up," I screamed at myself. "You have to keep going." Somehow I forced my leaden limbs to obey, staggering back to my feet. As I did, a low growl rumbled from the shadows to my left. I whipped around, heart hammering against my ribs. Two yellow eyes glowed in the darkness between the trees, fixed unblinkingly on me. The dog walker stepped into a shaft of wan moonlight, and I couldn't stifle a moan of terror. If I had thought it horrific before, it was 1,000 times worse now. The creature's form seemed to shift and flow like quicksilver, cycling through a nightmarish series of configurations. One moment it was an immense, misshapen wolf with a disturbingly human grin splitting its muzzle. Then it reared up on its hind legs, body twisting and elongating into a hunched, almost simian shape covered in shaggy fur. As I watched in horror, its front limbs lengthened grotesquely, paws splaying into dexterous, grasping appendages that were neither hand nor claw. "What's wrong, little rabbit?" it rumbled in its grating voice. "Don't like what you see?" The creature's outline wavered and blurred again, reforming into a terrible amalgamation of human and beast, as if evolution had taken a horribly wrong turn. "Does this suit you better?" The dog walker grinned at me with a lipless mouth bristling with shark-like teeth. Then it dropped to all fours and lunged, closing the distance between us in a single fluid bound. I threw myself aside just in time, feeling the wind of its passage as its heavy body hurtled past. Rolling to my feet, I bolted in the opposite direction, a scream building in my throat. I could hear the creature behind me panting with eagerness as it gave chase. It was done playing now. The real hunt had begun. Terror lent me speed I didn't know I possessed. I leaped fallen logs and dodged through the twisting maze of tree trunks, breath sobbing in my chest, pulse thundering in my ears. The dog walker matched me step for step, its claws tearing furrows in the loamy earth as it pursued me. I burst through a dense thicket and found myself in a small glade walled in by towering pines. And there, in the center of the clearing, was evidence that I wasn't the shapeshifter's first victim. A scatter of gnawed bones littered the ground, picked clean and gleaming dully in the moonlight. Tattered scraps of clothing and weather-beaten equipment, a boot, a rusting belt buckle, the shredded remains of a backpack, told a story of previous hikers who had ventured where they shouldn't. My stomach lurched and I staggered, the ghastly scene sapping the last of my strength. As if on cue, a shuddering howl rang out behind me, so close that it raised all the hairs on my nape. I spun to see the dog walker pacing out of the trees, chuffing with harsh laughter. "End of the line, Ranger," it said, eyeing me with malevolent glee. "No more running." The creature began to circle me, moving with a predator's lithe grace despite its unnatural shape. As it paced, it continued to morph, each new configuration more dreadful than the last. A yowling cat thing with burning green eyes, an oversized raven with the razor beak of a raptor, an enormous serpent with hideously human features. I dropped to my knees in the center of that awful boneyard, breath coming in ragged sobs. I had nothing left, no hope and no strength to keep fleeing. The dog walker had me dead to rights, and it knew it. The creature paused, head cocked as it watched me with a mixture of contempt and dark satisfaction. Then it reared up, towering over me as its shape stabilized into the awful fusion of man and wolf. It raised one taloned paw as if to strike, but then hesitated. Following its gaze, I turned to see the stony face of the bluff that formed a backdrop to the glade. There, nearly concealed behind a screen of dense vegetation, was a fissure in the rock face just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. A cave. Shelter. A final, desperate chance. Before the thought had even fully formed, I was scrabbling to my feet, diving towards that narrow crevice with the last of my fading strength. The dog walker howled in fury and gave chase, but I had a split second's lead. I jammed my body into the opening, feeling the rock scrape against my shoulders as I squirmed and wriggled. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I would stick fast, wedged in that cramped passage, but then I sucked in my gut and heaved forward, tumbling head over heels into a dank, musty-smelling space beyond. The dog walker's claws scrabbled at the stone, its enraged snarls echoing weirdly in the confines of the tunnel. But the opening was too narrow for its massive bulk. I heard it throwing itself against the rock, trying to force its way through, but to no avail. Panting, half-sobbing with relief and residual terror, I crawled deeper into the dark sanctuary of the cave. I had survived the hunt, but my ordeal was far from over. For this was the dog walker's domain, and I had only delayed the inevitable. In the oppressive blackness of that stone warren, I huddled in on myself and tried not to imagine what the long night ahead would bring. But one thing I knew with bone-deep certainty: the dog walker would be waiting for me when I emerged, and it was very, very patient. Time lost all meaning in the absolute darkness of the cave. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was the other way around. There was no way to tell. The only things that seemed real were the damp stone at my back, the musty air in my lungs, and the lurking patient presence just outside waiting for me to re-emerge. At some point I must have drifted into an uneasy doze, too exhausted to remain vigilant any longer. I startled awake an interminable time later with no memory of falling asleep, but the quality of the darkness had changed. The inky blackness had faded to a deep charcoal gray that hinted at approaching dawn. Cautiously, I crept towards the crevice that led out to the forest, straining my ears for any hint of the creature's presence. But I heard only the ordinary sounds of the waking woods, the chirps and trills of birds, the quiet rustle of small animals going about their business, the sough of the wind in the treetops. Drawing in a steadying breath, I eased my head out of the crevice and found the glade much as I had left it. The bones of the creature's previous victims still littered the ground, picked clean and forlorn. But of the dog walker itself, there was no sign. I slithered out of the cave mouth, my stiff muscles protesting. Rising unsteadily to my feet, I scanned the clearing and the surrounding trees but saw nothing. It was as if the night's horrors had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare, and yet the claw marks gouged in the soft earth at the base of the bluff said otherwise, as did the churned-up grass and soil that marked the creature's most recent kills. No, the dog walker was real enough, and even if it had abandoned its vigil for now, it was still out there somewhere. I had no doubt of that. Fear spiked through my veins again, but I tamped it down. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. The small signs of the creature's passage told me I was still deep in its territory. If I wanted to survive, I needed to get moving and find a way out of this forsaken wilderness. I picked a direction at random and set out, staying alert for any sign that I was being stalked. As I walked, I couldn't help but marvel at the strange dichotomy of the forest in daylight. It seemed so normal, so benign, with golden motes of pollen dancing in the warming air and dappled sunlight painting the tree trunks. It was hard to reconcile this mundane setting with the primal terrors of the night before, and yet a primordial dread still hung over everything, as if the landscape itself remembered the dark things that walked here. I found myself jumping at shadows, my heart lodging in my throat at every unexpected rustle or bird call. My nerves were raw and jangling, unraveling a little more with each passing minute, so it was almost a relief when I stumbled upon a small cabin tucked away in a hidden hollow. The structure had clearly been abandoned for some time. The roof sagged and the whitewash had largely flaked away, revealing the weathered gray of old wood beneath. A ramshackle porch wrapped around the front, its railing scabbed with lichen, but it was shelter, and I was in no position to be picky. Warily, I mounted the creaking steps and pushed open the door, which swung inward with a mournful groan of rusted hinges. The single room beyond was thick with dust and cobwebs, lit only by the wan rays filtering in through the dirty windows. A crude fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall, while a sagging bunk heaped with moth-eaten blankets occupied another. An old wooden table and chairs squatted in the center of the floor, faded and scarred with age. A few pieces of battered camping equipment lay abandoned here and there, relics of the cabin's long-gone occupants. But what immediately drew my eye was the clutter of objects heaped on the mantel above the fireplace. Intrigued, I crossed the room for a closer look. Scattered amongst the desiccated mouse droppings and general debris was an assortment of Native American artifacts. Arrowheads and flint knives, shards of painted pottery, a few small fetishes carved of bone or antler, and dominating it all, the unmistakable shape of a dream catcher fashioned from twigs and sinew. A prickle of unease worked its way down my spine. The presence of those items suggested this cabin had a history, and that history was somehow tied to the creature that hunted me. Everything I had seen so far, from the dog walker's grotesque shape-shifting abilities to its evident connection to these woods, recalled the ancient lore of the tribes who had once called this land home. Hands shaking slightly, I reached out and picked up the dream catcher, turning it over in my hands. As I did, a small scrap of hide tumbled out from behind it. Frowning, I bent to retrieve it. The hide was old and brittle. The ink faded to the color of old blood, but I could still make out the words scratched upon it, and they sent a fresh wave of horror crashing through me. Beware the Kwai-Kwai-Ai, the dog walker. Wears many skins, but the hunger is always the same. Cannot be killed, only contained. The web will hold it, but not forever. The web, the dream catcher. According to tribal traditions, the charm was meant to trap bad dreams and dark spirits, letting only good pass through. Whoever had left that message had apparently tried to use one to contain the Kwai-Kwai-Ai, and failed, which meant I was trapped here with it, in a crumbling cabin that could only delay the inevitable. The artifacts scattered on the mantel were a mute testament to the fate of the hut's previous occupants. They'd tried to make a stand here and paid the price, just as I would when the creature caught up to me. It was only a matter of time. Despair crushed down on me like a leaden weight, driving me to my knees on the dusty floor. All fight, all hope, drained out of me. I had nowhere left to run and no chance of fighting off the dog walker when it came for me. I could only huddle here amidst the moldering relics of the past and wait for death. But even as that grim certainty settled over me, my hand brushed against the hilt of my flashlight shoved through my belt. The touch of that steel cylinder rekindled a faint spark in my chest. If I was going to die, I would at least meet my fate on my feet, not cowering like a frightened rabbit. The dog walker wanted a hunt? I'd give it one. But this time, I'd be the one setting the ambush. If I was lucky, I could buy myself a little more time, and if I wasn't, well, perhaps I'd at least get the chance to look my killer in the eye before it dragged me down. I crouched in the deepening shadows of the cabin's main room, watching the red-gold rays of the setting sun paint the walls. Outside, the evening breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the musk of damp earth and pine. Soon night would fall and the dog walker would come, drawn to the man scent so out of place in its forest. But this time, I would be waiting. I'd spent the last few hours preparing as best I could, my initial despair giving way to grim purpose. Working feverishly, I'd reinforced the rotting timbers of the door and windows, though I knew they would only hold for so long against the creature's preternatural strength. I'd also fashioned crude weapons from what I could scavenge, a spear from a broken chair leg, a club from a piece of firewood, a makeshift flail from a length of chain. Pitiful defenses, but they were all I had. My flashlight I kept close at hand, its heft comforting despite the certainty that it could do little against my pursuer. Truthfully, I didn't expect to survive the coming confrontation. The dreamcatcher's dire warning made it clear that the dog walker could not be killed, only bound, and I had no means to contain it, but I was determined to fight nonetheless. I would meet my end as a man, not meat. And if I was very lucky, I might just wound the creature enough to buy myself an opening to escape. It was a thin hope, but it was all I had left. As the brassy light faded from the sky and full dark settled over the hollow, the normal sounds of the forest changed subtly. The chatter and bustle of crepuscular creatures gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional forlorn call of an owl. Then, threading through the stillness, came the distant howl I had been dreading. A ululating cry that rose and fell, distorted by the trees until it sounded only barely canine. A shudder worked its way down my spine, and my fingers tightened convulsively on the haft of my spear. The dog walker was coming. I could feel the weight of its presence, the ancient malice that prowled between the leaning trunks beyond the cabin walls. Sweat slicked my palms, and my heart thundered like a wild thing in the cage of my ribs. But I tamped down my fear. Now was the time for courage, however futile. I didn't have long to wait. No more than a quarter of an hour had passed before a shadow detached itself from the tree line, flowing towards the cabin with the inevitability of a nightmare. It crossed the weed-choked yard with impossible speed and fluidity, shifting between forms, now wolf, now man shape, now something obscenely in between. The dog walker reached the decrepit porch and reared up to its full height, its outline distorting and running like clay as it forced itself into a parody of human configuration. Lips skinned back from jagged teeth in a feral grin, it rapped one great twisted paw against the door in a grotesque mockery of politeness. Little pig, let me come in," it sing-songed, voice scraping against my nerves like broken glass. Then, without waiting for a response, it smashed one huge taloned fist straight through the rotted wood. The door exploded inward in a hail of splinters, and the dog walker ducked through the ruined portal, its bulk dwarfing the confined space. I bolted up from my crouch, bringing my spear to bear with desperate strength. But even as I lunged, the creature's form rippled and changed again. It dropped to all fours, flowing into the shape of a great tawny cat, all whipcord muscle and preternatural. It dropped to all fours, flowing into the shape of a great tawny cat, all whipcord muscle and preternatural grace. My spear glanced off its shoulder, drawing a thin line of ichor but barely slowing its charge. The thing that had been the dog walker slammed into me with the force of a battering ram, bearing me to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Fetid breath washed over my face as it pinned me with its bulk, one massive paw planted on my chest. I felt the bite of curved claws through my shirt and the thud of my own heart against my ribs. Snarling, the creature's jaws yawned wide. And then, to my horror, its features began to melt and run like heated wax. The feline contours vanished into shapeless flesh that pulsed and crawled, reforming into a new configuration. A loathsome amalgam of human and beast stared down at me, its wolfish muzzle and luminous yellow eyes set above a disturbingly man-like mouth. That mouth split into a vicious parody of a smile, bearing a double row of knife-edged teeth. "Foolish man thing," it rumbled, voice rough and grating. "Did you truly think you could defy me? I have stalked these woods since before your kind had words to name their fear." The dog walker leaned close, its carrion breath hot on my cheek. Its features rippled again, assuming the visage of a young boy with tousled hair, a perfect replica of my son Caleb. The creature blinked at me with my boy's hazel eyes, Caleb's crooked smile playing about its lips. "I know all the faces that haunt you," it said in my son's voice. "All the secret things that gnaw at your heart. I will wear each one in turn as I devour you." Slowly, bile surged up my throat and a red wave of mingled horror and fury crashed through me. Using my child's face against me, it was a violation too heinous to bear. With a wordless cry of rage, I heaved against the creature's weight, trying to throw it off, but it was far stronger than I. Laughing, the dog walker slammed me back to the floor hard enough to rattle my teeth. As I lay there stunned, it grabbed my forearm in its jaws, needle fangs punching through skin and sinew. White-hot agony blazed up my arm and I screamed, the sound high and ragged in my ears. The creature growled deep in its chest, a rumble of satisfaction as it worried at my arm like a dog with a bone. Through the haze of pain, I felt the crunch of breaking bone, the warm gush of my own blood. Animal panic clawed at the inside of my skull. It was going to rip me apart, piece by piece, but even as that certainty crystallized, my scrabbling fingers closed around the handle of my flashlight where it had fallen in the scuffle. Instinct took over, and I brought the heavy barrel down on the dogwalker's skull with every ounce of my fading strength. The creature yelped, more startled than hurt, and its grip on my mangled arm loosened. Wrenching free, I scrambled back until I fetched up against the wall, the flashlight clutched in my good hand like a talisman. The dogwalker stalked towards me, eyes ablaze with fury, body lengthening into something gaunt and many-limbed, a horror with too many joints. It coiled to spring, and I thrust the flashlight beam directly into that seething mass, the brilliant lance of light searing across its vision. The creature shrieked, flinching away from the illumination. To my amazement, I saw blisters erupt on its hide where the beam touched, the unnatural flesh charring and cracking. Emboldened, I advanced, keeping the light trained on the dogwalker's writhing form. It began to smoke and sizzle, the acrid stench of burning hair filling the cabin. Howling its rage and agony, the creature scrabbled backwards, trying to evade the punishing brightness. But there was nowhere for it to hide. Slowly, inexorably, the dogwalker began to crumble, its body dissolving into ash and oily vapor. One baleful yellow eye fixed me with a look of purest loathing as the flashlight beam bored into its skull. "This isn't over," it hissed through the ruin of its mouth. "I am the forest's dark heart. I will return, and the hunt will begin anew." And with that, the creature exploded into a swirling cloud of foul black smoke that billowed through the broken door and into the night, leaving only a pile of smoldering detritus behind. I don't know how long I sat there in the wreckage of the cabin, cradling my ruined arm and trembling with the aftershocks of terror and pain. Now that the adrenaline had faded, my whole body felt leaden, an exhaustion beyond mere tiredness dragging at my bones. But I was alive. Against all odds, I had faced the dogwalker and lived to tell the tale. It had been a near thing, and the cost had been higher than I cared to contemplate. But I had survived the long hours of darkness. Eventually, the golden light of true dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, banishing the last of the shadows. With the coming of the sun, the stifling pall that had hung over the forest seemed to lift somewhat, the sickly, watchful feeling draining away. On unsteady legs, I stumbled out onto the porch, drinking in the cool, clean air. Around me, the woods were coming alive, the chatter of birds and buzz of insects a blessed counterpoint to the creature's feral howls. I made my way out into the yard, each step a little easier than the last. My mangled arm throbbed with every heartbeat, but that meant I was still here, still moving under my own power. I'd take the pain as a reminder that my heart still beat. Exhaustion and blood loss made the hike back to the ranger station a blur. Somehow I found my way back to the trail, and from there it was simple enough to follow it mechanically, one foot in front of the other. By the time the weathered outbuildings came into view, I felt like a sleepwalker, my mind gone muzzy and distant. I don't remember stumbling through the door or collapsing onto the old camp cot shoved against the wall. After that, consciousness fled for a long time, my mind shielding itself in dark silence, free of dreams. I awoke some indeterminate while later, crusted in blood and grime, but with my head clear for the first time in days. Gingerly, I sat up and assessed the damage. My arm was a mangled wreck, the wounds already angry and inflamed. I'd need stitches, antibiotics, probably a splint. But all of that would have to wait, at least until I got back to civilization. For now, all I could do was clean and wrap the ragged gashes as best I could and hope to stave off infection. More concerning was the bone-deep chill that had settled in my chest. The dogwalker's words rang in my ears, taunting me. "I will return, and the hunt will begin anew." I knew with a cold, numb certainty that I hadn't seen the last of the creature. It was wounded, diminished, but as it had said, it was the living avatar of the forest's black heart. It would take more than a flashlight beam to end its foul existence for good. No, the thing that called itself Quiqui would be back. It had my scent now, and I knew it would never stop until it had run me to ground and torn the life from my breast. The only question was how long I had until the hunt resumed. Months? Years? There was no way to know. All I could do was try to heal, to prepare myself for the next time I walked into its domain. And walk there I would. I knew it with the heavy finality of a guillotine blade, for I could never be free while the dogwalker prowled the dark spaces between the trees. It would haunt my steps for the rest of my days, a living shadow hungering for my destruction. I would spend my life looking over my shoulder, knowing that inevitably I would feel its fetid breath on the back of my neck, unless, of course, I found a way to stop it first. I didn't know how I would do it. I had no clear path, only the raw determination to still my racing heart. But I would find a way or die trying. The alternative was a waking nightmare I couldn't endure. As I shouldered my pack with my one good arm and turned my steps towards home, I felt the weight of that grim purpose settle around me like a mantle. I knew it would be a long time before I slept without the specter of yellow eyes and glistening fangs lurking behind my eyelids, but this was not the end. Not yet. The hunt was over for now, but the war had only just begun. The old pickup truck bounced and rattled along the dirt Forest Service road, kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered golden in the early morning sunlight streaming through the pines. I guided the worn steering wheel with one hand, the other resting on the truck's rusting doorframe, feeling the cool autumn breeze caress my skin. It was my first week as a park ranger in the remote Blackridge wilderness. I had jumped at the posting, eager for solitude and a chance to lose myself in the pristine beauty of untouched nature, far from the smog-choked freeways and suburban sprawl of the city. As the road narrowed and the trees closed in, an eerie stillness descended. The cheery birdsong faded, leaving only the engine's low grumble and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I shrugged off a prickle of unease. It was just the quiet of the deep woods, that was all. I had better get used to it. I pulled over at the trailhead and hopped out, my boots thudding onto the hard-packed earth. Slinging my pack over my shoulders, I grabbed my hat and locked the truck. Double-checking the signage, I set off down the path that would take me to the first backcountry campsite I was to inspect. The sun dappled the trail as I walked, glinting off the dew-laden ferns and casting long shadows across the forest floor. But even as the day brightened, the wood seemed to darken, the underbrush crowding in close. The path, so clear and welcoming at first, now looked faint, nearly obscured by fallen branches and snarls of roots. I quickened my pace, unsettled. It must just be the angle of the light playing tricks on me. I was letting my city slicker nerves get the best of me out here in the big bad woods. Still, some primal instinct prickled at the nape of my neck, some ancient whisper that I was being watched. I shook my head and walked on. The birds had gone utterly silent. No chipmunks or squirrels skittered in the trees. The whole forest seemed to be holding its breath. I found myself straining to hear the normal sounds of nature, but the wood had stilled into an ominous hush. I rounded a bend in the trail only to stop short. A blackened gash marred a towering ponderosa pine, the bark clawed away to expose the pale cambium beneath. Ragged cuts crisscrossed the trunk far too high for any bear. An icy rivulet of dread trickled down my spine. Unslinging my pack, I dug for the battered wildlife guide and thumbed to the section on bark striping and antler rubbing. But even as I tried to reassure myself that there was some perfectly normal explanation, I knew that no deer or elk or even moose could have left those marks. They looked almost like claw marks. From something bipedal, something tall enough to reach higher than my head. I slowly looked up, an atavistic fear knotting in my gut. The forest canopy closed over me, suddenly more threatening than sheltering. In the heavy gloom between the trees, anything could be watching, waiting. I slung my pack on and all but jogged down the path, my heart thudding painfully in my ribs. The campsite and the gentle Linville Creek that ran beside it had never seemed so far away. Linville Creek burbled pleasantly in the afternoon sun, the dappled light dancing off the dun ripples. I knelt on the sandy bank, refilling my water bottles and trying to slow my galloping heart. The 2-mile hike from the trailhead had taken far longer than it should have, and not just because I kept glancing over my shoulder at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. The trail had been fading in and out, sections looking more like animal paths than maintained hiking routes. I had gotten turned around twice when it seemed to vanish entirely, the underbrush suddenly thick and grasping where I could have sworn the path had cut through a moment before. I splashed some cool water on my sweaty face and took a deep breath of the loamy air. I was just jumpy from too many nights spent poring over missing persons reports and decades-old newspaper clippings. Serial killers' dump sites, they called these sorts of lonely places. The dark maw of the American wilderness that swallowed people without a trace. A dark shape detached from the night, all wrong angles and elongated limbs. It stepped into the shivering pool of my flashlight, and I felt the scream rising in my throat die stillborn. It was a deer, or it had been once. Tatters of hide still clung to its gaunt frame, stretched obscenely over jutting ribs. Antlers sprang from its skull at unnatural angles, too many points, too sharp. And the eyes? The eyes were a sickly lamp-like yellow, pupilless and glowing with a feral, ravenous light. It took a lurching step toward me, hooves clicking on stone. Lips peeled back from jagged teeth too large for any natural deer in a hideous approximation of a smile. "Found you," it rasped. Vocal cords never meant for human speech straining and cracking around the words. I ran. There was nothing human left in that gaze, no mercy or reason to appeal to. There was only the hunt, and an eon-old hunger that would never be sated. Branches whipped my face as I plunged through the choked dark, heedless of direction, knowing only that I had to run, had to escape. The creature followed, crashing through the brush with a chilling, eager whine. My foot caught on a root and I went sprawling, the flashlight flying from my hand. I scrabbled in the dirt, whimpering, feeling for the cool plastic. But my seeking fingers found something else, something hideously warm and yielding. I yanked my hand back with a yelp. The flashlight beam glinted off something pale in the loam. Bones. Ribs and curving shanks in the unmistakable globe of a skull. Empty sockets staring in mute accusation. Scraps of rotted fabric clung to the yellowed remains. A backpack still slung across the caved-in chest. Some other unfortunate soul lost and torn apart in this pitiless wood. My gorge rose and I scrambled back, only to freeze at a soft, liquid huff of breath at my neck. I turned my head slowly, already knowing what I would see. The thing that had been a deer loomed over me, slavering jaws inches from my face. This close I could feel the heat of its breath, see the squirm of things that should not be moving beneath its ill-fitting hide. A cloven hoof pinned me with negligent strength, the splintered points pressing into my chest. Such fear, it hissed, tongue lolling obscenely between its teeth. Such sweet terror. I will savor it, little ranger. Savor you. It lunged, jaws yawning wide, and I screamed. I ran, heedless of the branches that tore at my face, the roots that twisted underfoot to trip me. All my vaunted skills, all my ranger training seemed to fall away until I was no more than a terrified animal, fleeing headlong through a night that cackled and gibbered at my heels. How long I ran, I could not say. Time lost all meaning in that choked, clinging darkness that pressed in on all sides. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed and the copper taste of blood coated my throat. I burst from the tree line into a small clearing and staggered to a halt, gasping. There, huddled against the far fringe of trees, was a cabin, small and dark. It crouched amid the weeds like a hunted thing. The weathered boards of its walls were gray with age, the small windows cracked or gone entirely. But it had a door. A solid-looking slab of oak still clinging stubbornly to rusted hinges. Shelter. Safety. Behind me, a twig snapped. I whirled, heart pounding. Caught in the spill of moonlight, the creature minced from the shadows on delicate hooves. It was different again, some new nightmare patchwork of predator and prey. Wolf and cougar and bear, all flowing together in a lurching, boneless gait as if its body were mere clay to be shaped. Only the eyes stayed the same, yellow and ravenous, and alight with a cruel, vicious intelligence. "Nowhere to run," it purred, voice like millstones grinding. "Nowhere to hide." I bolted for the cabin, leaping the rotted steps to crash against the door. It shuddered but held, and I scrabbled for the latch with numb fingers. With a groan of rusted metal it gave, and I tumbled over the threshold into musty darkness. I slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bolt, fingers crawling over the rough wood for any other locks. But there was only the one, a single frail ward against the night's hunger. I pressed my back to the door, chest heaving. The creature thudded against it, a lazy, taunting impact that rattled the hinges. Little pig, let me come in," it sing-songed, and the playful malice in its voice curdled my blood. It thudded against the door again, a sickening crack as its body broke and reformed to better scratch and pry at the bolt. Sobbing, I scrabbled away from the door in the feeble gray light that filtered through the cracked windows. I had to find something, anything I could use to brace it, to keep that thing out. My foot caught on something, sending me sprawling. I reached out, and my hand closed around something long and horribly smooth and rounded. I knew the shape of it, had felt it outside. A bone, a human bone. I choked on a scream as I scrambled back, decaying clothing and tattered skin catching in my hands. There was another body slumped in the corner, just visible in the gloom, and another, smaller, with scraps of bright fabric still clinging to the bird-like bones. A family. They had come here to shelter just like me, to hide. The creature slammed into the door again, the frame shuddering. Splinters rained down, the hinges shrieking. It would not hold much longer. I cast around desperately, looking for something, anything to defend myself. The mantel of the stone fireplace was littered with frames and knickknacks, dusty ceramic, and there, dully gleaming in the gray light, a knife. I lunged for it, snatching it from the mantel. It was old, the blade pitted but still wickedly sharp. Antler handle, yellowed with age, carved with symbols and whorls that seemed to writhe in the gloom. The tip of a claw punctured the door, slivers of wood flying. A yellow gloating eye peered through the hole. "Ready or not, little ranger, here I come." I clutched my pitiful weapon and waited for the door to give, for yellow eyes and rending claws and a hunger that would never be sated. And as the timbers cracked and the claws scrabbled and the triumphant laughter of the beast shivered the air, one thought crystallized in my whirling mind. Of course it was a skinwalker. Of course this cabin had seen horror and death. In the Forest Service you hear stories, the failures, the disappearances. Campers and rangers alike vanished into the maw of the wild. I had always scoffed, dismissing them. Scary stories and tall tales, nothing more. But the evil that gibbered and howled beyond the cracking door was all too real. And it had my scent. It would never stop, never tire, never rest until it had me. The door gave with a splintering crash, and yellow eyes blazed in the dark. The creature flowed into the cabin in a ripple of hide and flesh, reforming as it moved. The broken remains of the door dangled from its massive shoulder, casually shrugged off to splinter on the floor. It reared up on two legs as it crossed the threshold, tattered pelt sloughing away to reveal a broad, almost human chest glistening with an oily sheen. Longer, ropey limbs unfolded from the trunk of its body, tipped with scythe claws that clacked against the rotting floorboards. But the face, gods, the face. It split like overripe fruit, the muzzle retracting into the skull with a wet crunch. Teeth clattered to the floor as the jaw unhinged and reformed, the nasal cavity collapsing into a pair of thin, flaring slits. The yellow eyes stayed fixed on me, unblinking, as the nightmare sculpted itself into a terrible semblance of humanity. "No more hiding," it rasped, tongue visibly writhing behind jagged teeth. "No more running." I brandished the knife with trembling hands, a pitiful shield. "Stay back." Even to my own ears, my voice sounded thin and desperate. It laughed, a low, grating sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, don't be like that, little ranger. I just wanted to talk." It cocked its head in a grotesque parody of sympathy, the vertebrae in its neck popping. "That's what you do best, isn't it? Help lost little campers? Sweet-talk the tourists? Come on, ranger, talk to me." It lunged, faster than anything that size had a right to move. I yelped and dove aside, swinging wildly. I felt the blade connect, biting into dense flesh, and for a moment I dared to hope, but the creature only laughed. It swiped with one taloned hand, almost casual, and a line of fire exploded across my chest. I cried out, stumbling back, and felt my shoulders hit the wall. There was nowhere left to run. The thing loomed over me, ichor dripping from the gash in its chest. It grinned, wide and sharp. I do love it when they fight." It reached for me, the lamplight gleaming off its claws, and in that moment I knew I was going to die. This thing would rend me, break me, devour me. But just before those claws closed, something strange happened. The creature paused, its head cocking as if listening to a distant sound only it could hear. Then, slowly it began to change. The monstrous form rippled, flowing like wax. Talons retracted, leaving strong, blunt fingers. Patchy fur slicked away into tawny skin. The face reshaped, cheekbones rising, brow smoothing, lips thinned and reformed around blunt human teeth. I stared in numb horror as the creature resolved into a man. A horribly familiar man, with warm brown eyes and an easy lopsided smile. "Hey there, buddy," it said in my father's voice. Fancy meeting you here. It wasn't him. I knew that. Knew it in my bones. But gods, it had his face, the crow's feet around his eyes, the small chip in his front tooth from a tumble off his bike when I was 7. Aw, come on now. It spread my father's hands, taking a step forward. Don't look at me like that. It's been a long time, I know, but can a dad visit his son? You're not him, I whispered through numb lips. You're not my father. It tilted its head in that achingly familiar quizzical expression. Well now, that's a fine way to greet your old man. Another step, arms opening for an embrace. I scrambled back along the wall, pressing myself into the unyielding wood. The thing wearing my father's face clucked its tongue. Come here, son. Let's have us a hug, and then we can catch up proper like. I shook my head wildly, tears blurring my vision. No, you're not him. You're not. Always were a stubborn one. It lunged, hands outstretched. I dodged, ducking under its arm and stumbling into the center of the room. Still quick on your feet, I see. It turned to face me, grinning. Remember how we used to play ball out in the yard? Its form rippled, shifting again. Dark hair paling, shoulders narrowing. My mother smiled at me with warm hazel eyes. He always did love his sports. So proud of his little all-star. She held out a delicate hand. Why don't you just come here, baby? Come to Mama. I'll make it all better. Distantly, I was aware that I was shaking my head, mumbling denials through a throat closed tight with anguish. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But gods, it had their voices, the way she tilted her head just so. I backed away until I bumped into the cold stone of the fireplace. My hand groped desperately for a weapon, for anything solid to cling to in this swaying unreality. My fingers found the heavy iron poker leaning against the hearth. I snatched it up, brandishing it before me with trembling hands. You're not her. I won't let you do this, I won't. The thing with my mother's gentle smile stepped forward, hands open and pleading. Now, baby, you're not going to hurt your own mama, are you? Put that down before you do something you'll regret. Just come here, come to me. I swung the poker with a ragged cry. It stepped back, my mother's features melting away. For a fleeting instant, I glimpsed the true face beneath, something ancient and inhuman and coldly, pitilessly cruel. Then it lunged, a growl reverberating from a throat never meant for human speech. Fingers that ended in barbed claws closed around my neck, lifting me from the ground as if I weighed no more than a child. The poker fell from my nerveless grasp to clang against the floor. Silly little ranger, it purred, rancid breath hot against my face. Tricks are for kids. The pressure on my throat increased, an inexorable vice. I scrabbled weakly at its wrists, black spots dancing in my vision. It brought its face close to mine, lamp-like eyes boring into me with a cold, alien hunger. I will feast on your heart, it whispered, intimate and obscene. I will crack your bones and suck the marrow. I will wear your skin and walk in your world, and none will be the wiser. And I will savor every scream, every plea, every last shred of your agony. It smiled then, wide and sharp. But first, let's have a little fun, shall we? It leaned in, jaws yawning wide. I closed my eyes, a final prayer shuddering through me, and waited for the killing blow, but it never came. There was a whistling rush of air, a wet thud, and an unholy shriek that shattered the night. The crushing pressure on my throat vanished and I fell, choking and gasping, to the floor. Through the gray haze of my fading consciousness, I saw the creature stagger back, a crude wooden shaft protruding from its chest, black ichor pumped from the wound in sticky gouts. It clawed at the intruding object, talons skittering off the strange symbols etched into the haft. No, it howled, voice cracking and layering into a chorus of screams. No, it burns us. It spun, snarling, to face the open doorway. There, framed against the guttering light of a dying fire, stood the old man from the cave. He lowered a crude bow, his seamed face grim. You cannot have this one, Yinald Lushi, he said, soft but implacable. He is protected. The creature writhed, its form melting and running like candle wax. Curse you, witchman, it spat, words bubbling through a throat that collapsed and reformed with every breath. Curse your bones, curse your blood. The old man stepped forward, reaching into a pouch at his side. Begone, Dark One, crawl back to your shadow places, this hunt is over. With a gesture, he cast a scatter of herbs across the threshold. They flared with an actinic glare, etching the writhing figure of the skinwalker in stark light and shadow. It wailed, a thin, high sound of torment that went on, rising to an ear-splitting shriek. I clamped my hands over my ears, curling into a ball as the world went white at the edges. There was a sound like ripping fabric, a nauseating organic tearing, and then silence. Blessed, ringing silence, broken only by my own labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. I raised my head, hardly daring to hope. The skinwalker was gone. Only the splintered ruin of the door and a few oily smears marred the... I stood, stretched, and turned to examine the campsite. It was small but tidy, a packed earth tent pad surrounded by a scattering of trimmed logs for sitting. The stone-ringed fire pit was long cold, but something felt off, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite place. I walked the perimeter slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved in the sun-dappled shadows, no birds sang. The hair on my arms stood up. As I came around the backside of the tent pad, I finally saw them. Tracks in the soft dirt at the edge of the site, unlike any I had ever seen. Too big for a coyote, too small for a bear. Narrow ovals, almost like very large bare human feet. But where the ball of the foot should be, two long, tapered impressions dragged through the duff, almost like claws. A twig snapped in the forest and I spun, my hand flying to the bear spray on my belt. But the shadows under the pines were empty. Still, I could feel eyes on me. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Silence. Even the cheery gurgle of the creek sounded muffled, oppressed. Then, at the very edge of my hearing, came a faint, raspy breath. A deliberate, drawn-out inhale, sounding obscenely pleased. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt back down the trail to my truck and speed back to civilization as fast as the old pickup could go. But I was a park ranger now. This was my job, my duty, to investigate the strange and protect the innocent campers and hikers who relied on me. I made myself walk, not run, back to my pack, and with trembling hands pulled out my radio. I needed to report this, to call for backup. But as I keyed the handset, only static hissed back at me. I was alone in the deep, dark woods, and I was no longer certain that I was the only thing walking upright through them. The wind whipped the barren trees overhead as I trod steadfast through the thickening snow. I had been walking for some time, thinking I was going the same way from which I had come, but it was hard to tell as the few trail markers I saw I had certainly not noticed before. I peered into the swirling snow for any reference points but found none. The light was vanishing rapidly, and visions of a cold night in the open pushed me forward with tenuous courage. Then I saw it, there through the bare trunks. Was that the mouth of a cave? I stepped gingerly toward the dark hole in the earth. In the fading light, it looked like a wound in the skin of the world. But it could mean shelter for the night. From behind me came a low whimper, almost like an animal in pain. I spun, heart leaping into my mouth. The shadows betwixt the trees were deep and dark already. Anything could be hiding there. I tried to still my breathing, to listen over the frantic tattoo of my own pulse. But the wind only moaned long and low, as if the very forest itself keened its mourning. Turning back to the cave, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger. But I couldn't spend the night in the open, at the mercy of the elements and whatever else stalked these woods. Bowing my head, I walked into the black maw of stone. The scree crunched under my feet, echoing off the close walls. I clambered past huge tumbled boulders, feeling my way in the dark. The feeble beam of my flashlight bounced wildly over the stone. There in the back, was that the flicker of a fire? I hurried forward, only to stumble to a halt. The flashes resolved into eyes glowing amber in the darkness. Many eyes, glowing with feral, ravenous hunger. "What are you doing here?" came a voice from the black. I staggered back, my heart lurching. I didn't know anyone else was here. A match flared, illuminating in its small, warm aura an old man crouched before a neat fire. He was swathed in furs and hides, his face seamed with wrinkles and framed by long gray braids. Sharp dark eyes glinted above jutting cheekbones. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Not angry, but matter-of-fact. "This is no place for your kind." I bristled slightly, drawing myself up. "I'm a park ranger, sir. I have every right to be here. I'm just looking for shelter for the night." He studied me, an unreadable expression in those glittering eyes. Then he grunted. Better to freeze in the open than step into the den of the Yunol-Dlushi. A chill snaked down my spine at the unfamiliar word. The what? What are you talking about? The old man stared into the fire for a long, heavy moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. The Skinwalker, the evil that haunts these woods, stealing faces and forms. It is very old, very hungry, and once it sees you, it does not stop until it tastes your fear. I tried to laugh, but it came out high and thready. That's just a legend, a scary story. He looked at me and I flinched from the pity in his eyes. You'll learn, Bilagana. This is not your land. Things walk here that your people have forgotten. Old things, dark things. You cannot fight them. You can only hope to escape. With that, he turned from me in clear dismissal, tending to his small, struggling fire. I stood for a long moment, indecision twisting in my gut. Every instinct screamed to flee this crazy old man and his wild talk, but as I turned to go, I could swear I heard it again, drifting on the moaning wind, that breathless, eager whimper. Closer now, hungrier. I sank down against the cold stone, resigned to a long, sleepless night in the company of a stranger, and all the while I couldn't shake the crawling feeling of being watched from the darkness beyond the meager light. I huddled against the chill stone, my sleeping bag providing woefully little protection against the dank cold that seeped from the very bones of the mountain. The old man sat cross-legged before his meager fire, staring into the dancing flames as if scrying secrets from another world. Beyond the weak aura of our tiny haven, the night pressed close, full of malice. Each gust of the rising wind skirled through the bare trees with voices that sounded terribly, impossibly human. Sibilant whispers swirled on the moaning night air, words just at the edge of understanding. My flashlight beam flicked across the cave mouth, the shadows leaping and contorting gruesomely. Was that a flicker of eyes in the dark? A smear of deeper black detaching from the night? I blinked hard, willing my eyes to focus, but there was only the wind and the watchful woods. A twig snapped, shockingly loud, just beyond the edge of the light. I flinched hard, my heart slamming into my ribs. Across the fire the old man sat unmoving, face carved from stone. What was that? I whispered, hating the high, thready note of fear in my voice. For a long moment he was silent, still as a graven image. Then, slowly, he raised his head. In the guttering firelight, his eyes glittered like chips of obsidian. "It is coming," he said simply. "It knows you are here." A whimper quivered in my throat, some primal noise of terror dredged up from the ancestral dark. Every childhood nightmare, every half-forgotten horror story trembled to life, capering at the edges of the firelight. The old man shifted, drawing my frightened gaze. He reached slowly into the shadows and brought out a small leather pouch. With gnarled fingers he drew out a pinch of some dried herb, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. He cast the herbs onto the fire and they flared with a pungent, eye-watering smoke. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He glanced at me, his seamed face unreadable. "Trying to hide your scent, Bilagana, but it will not work for long. This thing, it is very old, very clever. It will find you." As if conjured by his words, a soft whisper of sound drifted from the mouth of the cave. A gentle scraping, a shush of something heavy being dragged over stone. I held my breath, straining my ears into the night. And then, at the very edge of hearing came the voice. "Rangur," it sighed, the sound somehow both guttural and sibilant. Hearing my title in that inhuman throat full of night chilled me to the core. It knew me. It was hunting me. "Rangur," it called again in a parody of sing-song, voice dancing on the wind. Come out, wherever you are, re." My hands were shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. But that terrible certainty, that pressure of unseen eyes, of uncoiling hunger slinking through the dark. The old man rose in one smooth motion, all frail-boned grace. He cast another handful of herbs, chanting low and rapid. The fire leapt and twisted, throwing monstrous shadows on the walls. "You cannot stay here," he said, low and urgent. "It knows where you are. You must go. Lead it away." "Go?" I nearly sobbed the word. "Go where?" His obsidian eyes bored into me. "Run, Bilagana. Run and pray it does not catch you. And so I ran, blundering out into the night with only my flashlight and my terror, the taste of magic herbs acrid on my tongue. And behind me, always behind me, the shush and whisper of something that had once been human stalking me through the whispering night. I crashed through the tangled underbrush, snarls of root and bramble tearing at my clothes, my skin. Branches lashed my face and pine needles stung my eyes as I blundered nearly blind through the choke dark of the deep woods. There was no trail here, no ranger's path. I had lost those long ago when I fled the dubious safety of the old man's fire. Now there was only the black woods and my own crashing steps and the hungry house that followed. It was toying with me. I knew that much with some primal, marrow-deep certainty. I had caught glimpses of it as I ran, a flutter of movement in the corner of my eye, there and gone, a skitter of claws on bark, a flash of teeth in the thicket, and always, underneath the drum of my own panicked breath, the soft rustle of something large pushing through the trees behind me, relentless and patient as dread. My flashlight flickered, the shadows leaping. The beam danced wildly as I ran, my hands numb and shaking. Dark trunks and grasping branches twisted into monstrous forms, leering faces in the strobing light. "Run, Gur!" The sigh shivered through the night, sibilant and eager. It sounded closer now, an obscenely liquid note underlying the word. "Tired yet, little ranger? Ready to recess?" A sob hitched in my chest, raw terror closing my throat. I couldn't outrun this thing, this cruel intelligence that wore skins like clothing. It would catch me. It was only a matter of time. The flashlight beam flashed across something pale in the underbrush. I skidded to a halt, heart-rabbiting. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. I snagged it with a trembling hand. Old flannel, faded. A torn shirt, or what was left of one. Dark stains marred the fabric. The stiff splatter pattern, horribly familiar from long ago forensic textbooks. Dread settled heavy and cold in my gut. Someone else had walked these woods, and from the looks of it they hadn't walked out. A twig snapped shockingly loud in the blackness behind me. I spun, flashlight held in front of me like a weapon, a talisman. Two eyes glowed at the edge of the shadows, huge and yellowly luminous. They blinked once, slowly, and my stomach turned over at the utterly calculating hunger, and I raised my head, hardly daring to hope. The skinwalker was gone. Only the splintered ruin of the door and a few oily smears marred the rough floorboards where it had stood. The old man leaned heavily on the doorframe, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked down at me, something like pity in his dark eyes. "You are lucky, Bilagana," he said, voice roughened with weariness. "Few who cross the path of the young old Lucy live to tell of it." I staggered to my feet, wincing as my abused muscles protested. What was that thing, really?" He sighed, the sound like wind through bare branches. "A thing of hunger and hate, born of forbidden magic and ancient evil. It preys on the lost, the weak, the foolish." He fixed me with a pointed look. I flushed, shame warring with residual terror. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I didn't believe." "No, your kind never does, not until it is too late." He shook his head. "The DNA know. We carry the stories, the warnings, but they are not for outsiders." He turned to go, shoulders bowed beneath an unseen weight. I stumbled after him, catching myself on the doorframe. "Wait!" I called, my voice cracking. "It's still out there, isn't it? It's not over." He paused, looking back at me. In the guttering firelight, his eyes were fathomless pools of shadow. "No," he said softly. "It is not over. The Yenold Lucy is a creature of hunger, and hunger never dies. It will be back." He raised a hand, sketching a sign in the air between us. "But perhaps now you will listen, now you will learn. This is not your land, Bilagana. There are older and hungrier things than you walking here." With that he was gone, fading into the darkness beyond the door as if he'd never been. I stood there a long time, listening to the low moan of the wind through the trees and the erratic thud of my own heart. Finally, moving like a man in a dream, I gathered my few scattered belongings. The knife I'd taken from the mantel caught my eye, glinting dully. After a moment's hesitation, I scooped it up and tucked it into my belt. A small and pitiful ward against the night, but it was better than nothing. Then, on legs that shook only slightly, I walked out of that place of blood and sorrow and into the waiting dark. The night enfolded me, cool and close, and I turned my face to the faint path that led back to the world of man. Behind me, the cabin crouched silent and lightless, keeping its secrets. The woods whispered with 1,000 unseen voices, and I fancied I could still feel the weight of those yellow, covetous eyes upon my back. But I walked on, one stumbling step after another into the uncertain future. What waited there I could not say. The morning sun would bring questions, reckonings. There would be reports to file, explanations to be made that no one would believe. But that was tomorrow. Now there was only the night, the woods, and the long, long road home. And though my steps were dogged by dread, by the knowledge of horrors lurking in the dark beyond the firelight, I did not stop. For in the end, that's all we can do. All any of us can do. Keep walking, keep putting one foot in front of the other. Even when the night presses close and the thing that is hunger and shadow and hate bays at our heels, we walk on, unto the dawn. And may whatever gods there be have mercy on us all. The sun rose slowly over the teeth of the mountains, staining the sky a bloody crimson. I stood at the edge of the overlook, watching it paint the valley below in shades of fire and shadow. I had made my halting way back to the trailhead, stumbling out of the woods just as the eastern sky began to pale. My pickup sat where I'd left it, a small bastion of normalcy in a world gone mad. It had taken me 10 minutes to fumble the key into the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could scarcely hold it, but I had made it. I had driven down the mountain, watching the trees thin and give way to the gentle slopes and winding roads of civilization. All the while, my mind churned, struggling to process, to accept the impossible reality of what I had faced in those deep, lost woods. Now, standing high above the waking world, watching the light chase away the clinging shadows, I could almost believe it had been a dream. Some terrible, fevered nightmare conjured by too many campfire tales and a long day's hike. But the wounds on my chest throbbed, the edges of the claw marks hot and tight. And I could not forget those eyes, those awful, knowing eyes alight with a feral, triumphant hunger. I breathed deep of the crisp dawn air, tasting the green of the pines, the dry dust of the rocks. Slowly, steadily, I rebuilt myself, gathered the shattered pieces of my courage and conviction. I would carry this, I knew, for the rest of my days. The stain on my soul, the inescapable knowledge of the hungry dark that lurked beyond the firelight, but I would not let it break me. I was a ranger, a guardian of these lands, and guardians could not afford the luxury of disbelief, of willful blindness. Not anymore. I looked out over the valley, the distant gleam of the town, the tiny ant-like dots of cars crawling along the highway. I had a duty to them, to all of the brave, foolish, unsuspecting souls that walked these hills, never knowing what watched from the shadows. I would find a way to warn them, to protect them, even if it meant facing those yellow eyes again. I turned away from the overlook, gravel crunching under my boots as I made my way back to the truck. There would be hard questions in the days to come, from my superiors, from the police, from the families of those I now knew had met a fate darker than death in these woods. I would bear that weight, do what I could to ease their suffering, but I would not forget, and I would not stop fighting. For now I knew the truth that lurked at the rotten core of the world, the truth of the Yinaldlushi, the skinwalkers, and all the hungry shadows with teeth. I paused at the door of the pickup, looking back at the woods that sprawled to the horizon, deceptively green and peaceful in the early light. They looked different now, knowing what I knew. Darker, despite the sun, deeper, hungrier. I reached out, running a hand along the weathered chassis of the truck. I would need to have the gashes in the door seen to, come up with some story to explain them away. But for now they remained, claw marks in the paint, a visceral reminder of the night's horrors. My fingers brushed the hilt of the knife at my belt. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive. Perhaps it would again taste the blood of the enemy, perhaps it would claim more of the dark in time. I did not know. I could not know. None of us could, we frail, mayfly creatures that flitted about our little lives, heedless of the dark beneath our feet. But I had learned, and I would not forget. I climbed up into the cab, wincing as the movement pulled at my wounds. I would need to tend to them, and soon, or risk infection. But for now, I simply sat, breathing in the familiar smells of old leather and engine oil. After a moment, I reached out and started the engine, feeling it rumble to life beneath me. I shifted into gear and pulled away, leaving the overlook behind. The highway unspooled before me, winding down, down, back into the world of man. I drove, and did not look back. Forward was the only way now. Forward, unto the uncertain dawn, and within my breast, hard and bright as a sliver of mirror glass, a new conviction took root and began, ever so slowly, to grow. A promise, a vow. Next time I would be ready. Next time I would not run. Next time I would make sure the price the skinwalker paid in blood and pain would far exceed my own. It was not much as determinations go. Little more than a spark, guttering against the endless black, but it was a start. The truck rolled on, carrying me into the dawning day. And behind me, unseen, the shadows shifted and sighed and settled once more into their ancient sleep, their hunger undiminished, waiting, always waiting, for the next foolish soul to step off the path and into their eager, endless embrace. The fog rolled in thick and damp as I shouldered my pack and set out along the trail. As an experienced park ranger, I was used to venturing alone into the remote Alaskan wilderness, but something felt different this time, an uneasiness that settled heavy in my gut as I took those first steps into the dense spruce forest. I was on a mission to search for a missing hiker who had failed to return from a solo trek. It wasn't unusual. Inexperienced adventurers often underestimated the dangers of the unforgiving landscape. But the circumstances around this disappearance unsettled me. The hiker was a seasoned outdoorsman, not some naive tourist, and he had vanished without a trace. As I trekked deeper into the shadowy timberland, an eerie stillness enveloped me. The usual chatter of squirrels and birdsong were oddly absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the frost-hardened earth. A twig snapped somewhere off to my left and I spun around, my hand reflexively going to the bear spray at my hip. My eyes probed the wall of trees, but I saw nothing, just the gnarled trunks and skeletal branches striped with shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that I was being watched. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After a few more miles, I paused to consult my map and GPS. I frowned. According to the coordinates, I should be nearing the missing hiker's last known location. But as I scanned my surroundings, confusion set in. There was no sign of any campsite or disturbance, just an unbroken carpet of rusted pine needles. It was as if this patch of forest had never been touched by human presence. Unease knotted in my stomach as I adjusted my pack and pressed on, delving ever deeper into the trees' lengthening shadows. Little did I know, I was being drawn into something far more sinister than a routine search and rescue. The warnings were there, subtle but unmistakable now that I look back. The hushed forest, the prickling sensation of eyes upon me. It was only the beginning of the nightmare that awaited me in that primordial wilderness. I should have turned back, right then and there. But I didn't. Driven by duty and overconfidence in my own abilities, I ventured forward into the whispering dark. To my doom, my compass began to spin erratically as I trekked deeper into the forest's gloom. I smacked it with my palm, wondering if the batteries were failing. The compass wobbled and then steadied, the arrow pointing not north but slightly east, directly into the most overgrown part of the woods. Shouldering aside dense brush, I entered a small clearing. A startled raven took flight from the tangle of branches overhead, its hoarse caw echoing like a mocking laugh. And that's when I saw them, strange cloven prints etched into the soft soil. At first glance, they resembled the tracks of some large deer. But as I knelt to examine them, icy fingers of dread walked up my spine. The gait was wrong, the stride length eerily inconsistent. No creature of flesh and bone and instinct made those prints. I rose slowly, my hand again finding the reassuring canister of bear spray at my belt. My eyes panned the clearing's perimeter, searching for whatever had left those unnatural tracks. The forest had fallen unnaturally silent, not even the whisper of a breeze stirring the branches. It felt like the calm before the storm. Without warning, a figure detached itself from the tangled shadows. I sucked in a startled breath, my heart slamming against my sternum. But it was no monster that stepped into the clearing, just a stooped, wizened old man, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, pinning me with piercing dark eyes that belied his aged appearance. Not alone. Not with night coming on. I'm a ranger, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm searching for a missing hiker. You haven't seen anyone out here, have you? The old man shook his head slowly. No one living? A chill rippled through me at his odd choice of words. He took a shuffling step closer, lowering his voice to a gravelly whisper. There's something out there, in the deep woods. Something old and hungry. You'd best turn back now, while you still can. I opened my mouth to press him further, but a sharp crack echoed from somewhere in the trees behind me. I spun around, scanning the shadows between the towering evergreens. For a split second, I glimpsed a flash of pallid grayish-white moving between the trunks. Something that almost looked like human skin. I blinked hard and it was gone, leaving me to wonder if my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I turned back to question the old man further, the clearing was empty. No sign of him or his tracks in the soft loam. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Unnerved, I set off again, noting that the sun was beginning its rapid descent toward the serrated black peaks in the distance. I needed to find a place to make camp for the night, preferably somewhere defensible. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, stalked. The back of my neck prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move. Once I caught a flicker of motion out of the corner of my eye and jerked my head around. I thought I saw an impossibly tall, spindly figure ducking behind a tree. But when I blinked, there was only the reaching shadow of a spruce bough. Get a grip, I chided myself. You're letting the isolation get to you. Just focus on setting up camp. If only I had heeded the old man's warning. If only I had turned back when I still had the chance. But the stubborn streak that served me so well as a ranger refused to let me quit. I told myself I imagined the strangeness, that my mind was just playing tricks. So I pressed on even as true night fell like a shroud across the primeval forest and the nightmare that was stalking me closed in. The light failed with unsettling swiftness, the sun swallowed whole by jagged peaks. In the thickening twilight, the shadows between the hemlocks and spruce deepened to pools of Stygian black. Even the beams of my high-powered flashlight seemed to strain against the impenetrable dark. I tried to keep my bearings as I searched for a suitable place to make camp, but an unshakable sense of disorientation crept over me. The trees all looked the same, my surroundings an endless labyrinth of reaching trunks and grasping branches. Overhead, unfamiliar stars glinted coldly in the narrow gaps between the evergreen boughs. Skirting a tangle of deadfall, I stumbled into a small clearing. The remnants of an old campfire pitted the center, ringed by a few large flat boulders. Relieved, I unslung my pack, my shoulders aching from the weight of my gear. But as I bent to clear the old ashes away, my relief curdled into dread. Caught in the wan beam of my flashlight, a scrap of fabric poked from the soft soil, a torn, blood-stained shred of flannel shirt. Hands shaking, I lifted it gingerly for a closer look. The ragged edge looked like it had been chewed by teeth or ripped by claws. Fighting to steady my breathing, I swept my light over the rest of the abandoned site. Now that I looked closer, I could see other signs of disturbance. Gouges in the soft loam, like something heavy had been dragged, a splintered tree branch, hanging by a thread of bark, and there, caught in a snarl of roots protruding from an overturned log, a broken camcorder. Heart thudding dully against my ribs, I gently worked it free, dreading what I might see. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. The camera rustled, like someone was adjusting their grip. Then a man's ashen, sweat-slicked face filled the frame. His eyes were wide and rolling with terror, his lips trembling as he spoke in a cracked whisper. I don't know what's after me. But it's not human. It keeps changing shape. It took them, Carl, Becca, little Ash. Oh God, the sounds they made. The screams. The camera tilted wildly as a chilling sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond the weak illumination thrown by his campfire. A shuddering, rasping breath. Then another, and another, growing louder, closer. No, no, please, the man choked out. The camera jounced as he staggered to his feet. Stay back! Something pale and glistening his knife swept into frame. The breathing turned to a rattling growl that raised every hair on my body. The man screamed high and awful. The camera tumbled, leaves and dark earth whirling across the screen, and the recording cut to static. Bile scalded the back of my throat as I wrenched my gaze away, the night pressing in close and suffocating. I realized I was gripping my bear spray hard enough that my knuckles ached. Fighting the urge to bolt, I made myself think rationally. Whatever happened to this man, jumping blindly into the dark wouldn't help me. Or him. I had to keep my wits, bide my time until dawn. Then I could hike out, alert the authorities about what I'd found. But as I set about making camp with hands that shook, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, something ancient and malevolent stalking me from the Stygian recesses of the forest. Unease wrapped around me like a burial shroud as I kindled a small fire and unrolled my bivy sack. Every rustle of foliage, every sigh of wind plucked at my nerves. To calm myself, I tried to recall snippets of an old Tlingit myth I'd heard once, about a creature of smoke and shadow that preyed on the souls of wayward travelers. But the harder I tried to remember, the more the details slipped away like dissipating mist. Exhausted, I finally slipped into a restless doze, one hand still wrapped white-knuckled tight around the bear spray. Sleep brought no respite. Only nightmares I would come to wish were just products of my imagination. And something far worse than I could have ever dreamed. Watching and waiting from the whispering dark, I jolted awake to the sound of feet crunching through the leaf litter close by. Disoriented, I sat up, shivering in the chill air with my sodden sleeping bag pooled around my waist. My fire had burned down to smoldering embers, casting a dim red glow over the small clearing. The footsteps came again, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight in a slow, deliberate tread. My lungs tightened with each resounding crack of branch and rustle of fallen leaves. There were no trails out here, no reason for anyone to be creeping around in the woods at this hour unless they didn't want to be seen. Throat closing around a knot of fear, I reached for the bear spray at my hip with a clammy hand, never tearing my gaze away from the velvety gloom between the reaching branches at the edge of the clearing. "Hello?" My voice came out dry and cracked. "This is Ranger Hawkins with the Park Service. I know you're out there. Show yourself." The footsteps halted. An odd staticky hiss filtered through the trees, raising every hair on my nape. Then, dreadfully, a voice rasped from the shadows. A voice I knew all too well. "Matt? Is that you?" Icy sweat prickled along my hairline. It couldn't be. That trembling, frightened voice belonged to my kid sister, Haley. But Haley was 2,000 miles away in Seattle, probably fast asleep in her dorm room. "Hales?" I answered shakily. "What are you doing out here?" She let out a broken sob. "I'm lost. Please, you have to help me." Unthinking, I lurched to my feet, a leaden feeling in my gut urging me to go to her even as some deep primal instinct screamed at me to stay put. I took one halting step toward the shadows, then another. "Don't worry, I've got you," I called out hoarsely. "Just come into the light and we'll—" I froze, the blood draining from my face as a gangly, emaciated figure crept from the tree line on all fours. In the guttering light of the fire, I saw that its limbs were too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles as it skittered toward me like a crab. But that wasn't the worst of it. My mind struggled to process the horror of the thing's face, or what passed for a face. The features were runny and indistinct, like a crude wax sculpture left too long in the sun. Except for the eyes, fathomless pits of pure darkness staring out of that half-melted ruin. Eyes that burned with a cold, sick intelligence as the creature unfolded upright with a bone-cracking pop of vertebrae and tendons. Slowly, hideously, the mouth yawned open to reveal a pulsing, lamprey-like throat ringed with needle teeth. And then it spoke again in my sister's voice. "What's wrong, Maddie? Don't you recognize me?" My scream caught in my chest as I groped for my bear spray with wildly shaking fingers. I raised it in front of me like a talisman. The creature hissed, hackles raising along the knobs of its spine as it crouched. I didn't give it time to spring. I squeezed the trigger and felt the kick of pressurized spray. A caustic stream of capsaicin hit the thing directly in its horrible face. It reared back with an eardrum-shredding shriek of rage and pain, pawing at its eyes. I didn't wait to see what effect the bear spray had. Heart pounding like a war drum, I spun on my heel and crashed into the brush, abandoning my pack, my gear, everything. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, tasting hot copper on my tongue. My hitching breath sounded deafening in my own ears. In the distance behind me, I heard an ululating howl that sent fingers of ice crawling up my spine. The creature had recovered. and it was coming for me. I plunged deeper into the dark heart of the forest, chased by the whisper of feet in the underbrush, and the knowledge that there were things in this world that wore human faces but held only endless hunger where a soul should be, lungs burning. I ran through the ink dark of the forest. Low branches whipped at my cheeks and eyes. Roots clutched at my ankles like grasping hands. But I barely felt them, numb to anything but the sharp animal terror that flooded my bloodstream. Behind me, I could hear the creature loping between the snarled tree trunks in pursuit. Not running, but pacing me with a cruel, measured tread. Like a wolf with a wounded deer, herding me deeper into its lair. Mist seeped from the black gums of its pine needle teeth, alive with the cold, static charge of its unnatural presence. I choked on the acrid stink of it, like burning insulation and rotted meat, as the fog crept inexorably closer. My boot caught on a root and I went sprawling, the bear spray flying from my grip to vanish somewhere in the underbrush. I scrambled backwards on my elbows, wheezing for breath as a dark, spindly figure detached itself from the fog. My heart seized in my chest. It was the thing that had worn my sister's face by the campfire. But as it crept closer, I saw its skin rippling, the features rearranging themselves like clumps of clay on a potter's wheel. The new face made me recoil in instinctive revulsion. It was the man from the camera footage, the one whose broken body I was sure moldered somewhere in this forsaken forest. But his eyes were the same endless voids, like portals into a place where the rational laws of nature held no sway. A keening wail bubbled up my throat as those pitiless eyes fixed hungrily on mine, and it spoke without moving its stolen lips. I heard its sibilant whisper slithering through my mind, cold and oily like a tangle of worms. "Nowhere to run, little mouse. This forest is mine, has always been mine, and soon you will be too." The words were like a tar-thick poison, seeping into the cracks of my mind. I opened my mouth to scream but couldn't force the air past the blockage of terror in my throat. The creature took another gliding step closer, its limbs moving with an obscene, boneless fluidity. Groping blindly behind me, my hand closed on a rock, its surface slick with loam and old rain. Desperation surging through me, I heaved it at the advancing monstrosity with all my remaining strength. The stone struck the creature between its depthless eyes with a sickening thud. It reeled back, spindly arms windbilling, a high, ear-splitting shriek tearing from its strange throat. Black ichor splattered the leaves at my feet as I staggered upright on watery legs and plunged into the trees once more. Bracken and thorny underbrush tore at my clothes as I crashed through, gulping air in ragged sobs. Pain lanced up my calf as a buried branch found flesh and I bit back a yelp. There was no time to stanch the wound. I could already hear my pursuer thrashing in the bushes behind me, its furious screeches raising every hair on my nape. My heart battered itself against my ribs as I forced my burning legs into a shambling run. Through the ringing in my ears, I distantly registered the rush and trickle of running water, a stream. If I could just reach it, put water between myself and the thing stalking me. I nearly wept with relief as I broke through a screen of brush and saw the obsidian gleam of water by the faint light of the cloud-scudded moon. Gasping, I half fell down the crumbling bank, my boots squelching in the soft mud. The glugging current tugged at my shins as I staggered through the shallows, eyes straining to pick out a path to the opposite side. But before I could haul myself up the far bank, a blood-curdling howl shattered the night. A howl that sounded horribly, impossibly familiar. I spun, the breath shriveling in my lungs as a translucent figure staggered out of the tree line. Its form swam and blurred like an image rippling beneath the water. But I still recognized the slight curving shape, the long fall of dark hair. "Haley?" I croaked. Her eyes were moon-pale in her haggard face as her lips moved in an endless, soundless scream. She reached for me, fingers clawed with agony, heart in my throat. I took a halting step back toward the bank, toward my sister's tortured shade. And in the split second before the surface tension of whatever illusion the creature had spun shattered, I saw triumph flare in the hellish void of its eyes. Cursing, I wrenched myself away and splashed toward the far side of the stream, fighting the sucking pull of the muck. The thing wearing my sister's face let out a piercing, unearthly screech like an eagle with a rabbit in its claws. Somehow I heaved myself up onto the bank, slipping and scrabbling in the soft clay. Whimpering low in my throat, I threw myself forward into the razor-edged brambles. feeling them tear at my clothes, my skin, anything to put distance between myself and the inexorable horror behind me. But no matter how fast or far I fled, I could feel its presence still, an oil-slick taint coating the back of my tongue. The taste of its depraved hunger. I was only prey to it, I understood with numb, gut-deep certainty. Prey to be run to ground, and sooner or later I would falter. The forest was its domain. It would run me in circles until exhaustion hobbled me, until my will and my sanity crumbled. A sob hitched in my chest as I stumbled on, heedless of direction. My muscles quivered and jumped beneath my sweat-slick skin. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, how much more my battered mind and body could take before they failed me. But one thing I did know, as I felt the noose of the hunt tightening around my throat, was that I couldn't let that happen out here, alone in this primeval wood that reeked of ancient festering evil. If I was going to make a final stand, it had to be soon. Gritting my teeth against a wave of bleary exhaustion, I forced my leaden legs into a jog and scanned the endless trees for any sign of shelter, any chance at momentary respite to form some kind of plan. That's when I saw it, rising out of the gloom ahead like a ghost. A small ramshackle cabin, its weathered timbers all but invisible until I nearly blundered right into them. Hardly daring to hope, I limped to the door and tested the handle. It swung open with a rusty shriek, and the stale odor of abandonment billowed out to meet me. My heart leapt. Sanctuary, however meager and temporary. With a last harried glance over my shoulder at the whispering dark, I ducked inside and slammed the door behind me. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time since I'd set foot in this cursed forest, I dared to let myself believe I might survive to see another dawn. I should have known better than to hope. Should have known that the most twisted nightmares are the ones that let you think, even for a moment, that you've escaped them. Dust choked the air and cobwebs hung in ropey skeins from the rafters as I barred the cabin's flimsy door behind me. In the milky light of my flashlight, I saw a Spartan interior of rough-hewn furniture and a cracked, sooty wood stove squatting toad-like in one corner. A place for passing hunters to shelter from storms, from the looks of it, though it had clearly been abandoned to the elements for years. Still, 4 walls were 4 walls, and any port was welcome in the tempest of madness and horror that had become my existence since setting foot in these blighted woods. Shivering, I slumped against the nearest wall, feeling the adrenaline that had sustained my harrowing flight begin to gutter out. My limbs shook like I'd just run a marathon, my clothes plastered to my skin with fear sweat gone clammy. As I stood there struggling to marshal my fractured wits, a strange scratching sound reached my straining ears, hoarse and frantic like an animal caught in a trap, and it was coming from inside the cabin. I went rigid, the beam of my wavering flashlight swinging toward a shadowed corner. A tattered canvas tarp was strewn across the floor, half hiding something bulky and misshapen, something that twitched and heaved beneath its folds, as if alive. Heart clawing its way up my throat, I took one trembling step closer, then another. Some masochistic impulse to know the worst of whatever fresh nightmare this was drove me forward, even as the sane part of my mind howled at me to run, to get out now while I still could. The scratching fell abruptly silent as I seized a corner of the musty tarp in one white-knuckled fist. Bracing myself, I whipped it back to reveal packs, rusted lanterns, a scattering of yellowed newspapers, and there, jutting from a mildewed rucksack, the source of the awful scratching, a human arm, dried to a leathery husk, the gnarled fingers still spasming, as if in their final death throes. I must have made some kind of noise, some raw animal sound of horror and revulsion, but I couldn't hear it over the roaring static that filled my skull as I stared at the desiccated limb, the only remaining piece of the poor bastard who'd once made the fatal mistake of seeking shelter here. What had done this to them? Butchered them like a rabbit in a snare and left this ghastly remnant as some kind of sick trophy or... No, that wasn't the question I really needed to be asking, was it? I knew what had killed them, the same thing that had been stalking me since I was foolish enough to venture into its hunting grounds, since I caught the first whiff of its foul, sulphurous stench on the wind and felt its void-dark eyes watching me from the abyss between the trees. The real question, the one that sent sour bile creeping up the back of my tongue, was why it had slain that other hiker but left me alive. Why it seemed content to toy with me, wearing faces plucked from my thoughts while it played out its sadistic game of cat and mouse. Bile rose in my gorge as a horrific possibility unfurled in my mind like a night-blooming flower. What if I wasn't only the prey in this twisted hunt? What if in some sick way I was also the bait? The thing in the woods, it had rooted through my memories like a child pawing through a toy box, plucking out faces that it knew would hurt me to see profaned. My sister, the man from the camera, his dying moments seared into my brain. It wanted me off balance, deranged with grief and horror, softened up before the killing blow. But for what purpose? Dizzy with dawning dread, I staggered back from the severed arm and nearly toppled over an old steamer trunk shoved beneath the cabin's single filigreed window, catching myself against the rough-hewn wall. My gaze fell on a sheaf of papers scattered across the trunk's surface. Hands shaking, I snatched one up, fighting to focus my blurring vision on the faded copperplate script. It was a journal entry dated 1887. The ink had bled and faded with age and damp, but I could still make out snatches that sent fingers of ice creeping up my spine. Something in the woods. Where's the faces of the taken? Trying to lure me out. The Tlingit elders speak of it in hushed whispers. A walker between worlds. The last of its foul kind. Gina, my sweet Gina. It took her, the words dissolved into jagged, nonsensical scrawls then, as if the journal's owner had finally succumbed to the same clawing madness I could feel squatting at the edges of my mind. But it was enough. Enough for the final puzzle piece to slam home with a greasy click of horrible enlightenment. I understood now what the creature truly was, what it really wanted from me. The Tlingit legends spoke of an ancient race, neither human nor animal, that preyed on wayward souls in the forgotten places of the earth. Shapeshifters that could drink memories and assume the forms of their victims, all to serve a single insatiable hunger, the hunger for new skins to wear, new identities to steal. And I was to be the next. The thing in the woods meant to subsume me, consume my mind, my very sense of self. Slither into my skin and wear it like an ill-fitting suit. The knowledge settled over me in a smothering shroud of despair. I sank to my knees on the warped boards, my strength fleeing my body like sand through a sieve. Distantly, I registered the crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin, slow and inexorable, savoring their victory. I was an insect in a spider's web, too exhausted to thrash against my fate any longer. All I could do was wait in numb horror for the creature to come and collect its prize. Wait for the sweet oblivion when it cracked open my skull and poured itself inside to hollow me out. No. A single stubborn ember still smoldered in the cooling ashes of my will. No, I wouldn't let this be my end. Better to go out fighting than let myself become a puppet dancing on eldritch strings. My hand fell to my belt, to the one weapon I had left, the utility knife that rode on my hip, its weight suddenly heavier than worlds. I knew I couldn't kill the thing that hunted me, this primordial evil that had stalked the dark places since before mankind's ancestors first shambled erect. But maybe I could wound it enough to make it think twice about swallowing me whole. Enough to buy myself a chance, however slim. I pulled the knife from its sheath, the rasp of metal on leather obscenely loud in the waiting hush. A terrible calm descended over me as I levered myself to my feet, blade held low and ready at my side. Outside, the footsteps reached the porch. A long, eerie creak as a weight settled on the rotting boards. The wet, rasping breath of a predator scenting cornered prey. I swallowed hard, fear a sour coating on my tongue. "Come on then, you bastard," I croaked, my voice echoing strangely in my own ears. "Let's finish this." There was no reply. But the intent, heavy silence spoke volumes. Slowly, tortuously, the door began to creak open on rusty hinges, and pure atavistic darkness invaded the cabin with the reek of an open grave. My heart slammed against my ribs like a caged rabbit as the cabin door eased inward on its corroded hinges. In the slice of night it admitted, something pale and hideously fluid oozed into the room with the obscene grace of an oil slick. At first it had no shape or features, just a vaguely bipedal silhouette of the same quivering, semi-translucent material that had imperfectly aped my sister by the banks of the stream. But as it drew itself upright, it split and curdled into a new configuration, one that was disturbingly familiar. The face that swam into focus out of that clay-like morass was my own. My eyes, my nose, my mouth, all reflected back at me in a funhouse mirror of pallid, dripping flesh. But it wasn't an exact facsimile. The thing had parsed my memory for the version of myself that frightened me the most. A distorted self-image, bloated by anxiety and self-loathing, the me reflected in the black mirror of sleepless nights when doubts gnawed me raw and merciless. The not me smiled, a rictus gash in its waxy face. When it spoke, its voice buzzed along my nerves, simultaneously inside my head and in my ears. "Look at you, little mouse, so frightened, so frail. Is that truly the best skin you have to offer me?" I flinched as if slapped, fingers tightening on the hilt of my knife until my knuckles groaned. "What's wrong? Don't you like this shape?" it mocked, cocking its head at an impossible angle. I pulled it straight from your mind. Fear closed around my windpipe, thick and choking. I had to fight for breath, for any scrap of defiance. "Go to hell. You're not me." Its chuckle was like sandpaper on my raw nerves. "Oh, I will be. Once I peel the ego from your bones and slip you on like a favorite coat. Won't that be nice? I can almost taste your memories, your precious identity. The sweetest flesh of all." It made a grotesque slurping sound. In the lantern light, I could see saliva beading at the corners of its mouth. Or maybe that was just more of the hissing, noxious mist that seeped from its pores with every rattling breath. "Why?" I croaked, stalling for time. For what I didn't know, there was no help coming, no cavalry riding to my rescue. But anything was better than letting my mind snag on the horror of this thing wearing my face, the violation of it picking through my brain with psychic fingers. Why me? Its features rippled, reshaped themselves. Suddenly, I was looking at a craggy, weathered visage, blanched of all color. A face I recognized from faded photographs in a historical society pamphlet. John Connolly, the trapper whose journal I'd found. The man who'd first written of the walker between worlds over a century ago. "Because you came to me," it said in a voice like a rusted hinge. "Blundered into my woods reeking of loneliness and despair, the most succulent flavors I couldn't resist a taste." I thought of the missing hiker I'd been tracking, the one whose disappearance had first drawn me into the creature's web. A chill scraped its fingernails down my spine. How long had this thing been watching me? Luring me in? I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs of dread. I'd been a fool, letting it goad me, play on my fears. That was how it weakened its prey, I saw now. Corroded their sense of self, of the borders between nightmare and reality, until they collapsed in on themselves like rotten fruit. But I wasn't beaten yet. Not while I still had breath in my body and a weapon in my hand. Desperation and defiance surged through me, burning away the fog of horror and hopelessness that admired me. I lunged at the creature, my knife flashing in a silver arc. Its stolen eyes widened in surprise as the blade bit deep into the junction of neck and shoulder. Not a killing blow, but it was enough to make the thing stagger back with an ungodly shriek, black ichor spurting from the wound. "That's for wearing the faces of the dead, you son of a bitch," I snarled. The creature writhed, its outlines losing cohesion, melting like wax in a flame. When it resolidified, it was wearing yet another skin. This one ripped straight from my most treasured memories. "Matt," it crooned in my mother's voice. "Sweetheart, you're hurt. Let me help you." It spread its arms, an obscene mockery of maternal comfort. For a split second I wavered, that scared little boy still inside me yearning toward her. But then I saw the emptiness behind the thing's eyes, as devoid of human warmth as the void between stars. Saw the needle teeth crowding its mouth where my mother's smile should be. With a roar that was equal parts anguish and rage, I slashed at it again. This time my knife found its face, cleaving ruin through the delicate structure of cheek and jaw. The creature howled, reeling away in a splatter of ichor. Before it could recover, I was on it, stabbing again and again in a frenzy. Chipped nails, the burst of a ruptured eye, the crunch and suck of an open throat. I lost myself in the savage ecstasy of hurting the thing that had violated my mind, made sport of my deepest traumas. Dimly I heard myself making animal noises, wordless snarls bubbling with spit. At last I stumbled back, chest heaving. The creature lay twitching at my feet in a lake of its own viscous blood. Slowly, so slowly, it lifted its ravaged head. "Is that all you've got, little mouse?" it gasped, a gurgling laugh. "Just a few more cuts and bruises for me to savor before I swallow your soul?" With dawning horror, I realized my mistake. I hadn't truly hurt it, only fed its bottomless hunger for suffering, and now I had nothing left. My knife fell from my nerveless fingers as I sank to my knees in despair. The fight drained out of me, my will to resist shredded like the flesh I'd so uselessly carved. It had only been toying with me, a cat batting around a broken mouse before the final kill. "She, little mouse," it crooned as it crept closer, its form knitting back together with obscene speed. "The struggle is over now. Time to sleep. Time to dream yourself into the sweet dark." I felt its mind pressing against my own, slick and cloying, dredging up all my secret shames, my buried guilts, every ugly shadow self-thought. All the threads of me it would unravel and subsume. Then, with an oily surge of triumph, it poured itself into me, into my gaping wounds and unguarded psyche, and I shattered, became a hall of screaming mirrors, endlessly reflecting the abomination invading me. The last thing I felt was my lips, moving of their own accord. Heard my voice, but not my words, slithering out like grave worms. "This skin will do nicely. Rest now, little mouse. There's no more need for you." And then there was only the void. Only the creature, wearing me into the waiting dark. I float in fractal dreams, my mind a tattered patchwork of memory and madness. Time is a frayed string, snapped and knotted back on itself. I surface briefly, choking on brine, on bile. There is blood on my hands, under my nails, a body at my feet, slack-faced in the pale light of a cold dawn. Not me. Both me. I try to remember which is the true thing. The shell, or the dark passenger crouched behind my eyes. The name when it comes feels foreign on my tongue. Tastes of wormwood and old sorrow. Matt. My name. It was Matt. A soft sigh, like wind through falling leaves, unspools through my mind. Poor little mouse. Still fighting. Still trying to untangle the knots. Fingers of ice walk up my spine. The voice is inside me, marrow deep. Its satisfied echoes fill up all my hollow places. I look down at the knife clenched in one white-knuckled fist. The blade winks mockingly in the early light. For a stretched elastic second I feel my grip tighten, feel the urge to turn it inward, to cut out the invasive rot spreading through my veins. None of that now. My hand falls slack. The knife tumbles away. I can only watch, a spectator in my own skull, as my body clambers stiffly to its feet. As it turns its back on the dead, staring thing that wears my face like an ill-fitting mask, panic flares, then gutters out, a meaningless animal spasm. I am small, so small, cowering in the labeled boxes in dark cubby holes of memory. The thing that moves me now is vast, a midnight ocean pressing down. It steers my faltering steps back toward the shuddering trees. Their whispers rake across my skin like a lover's nails, a susurrus of fallen tongues. New hunting grounds, it croons, new faces to try on. You will like it in time. As they all do, my sluggish heart clenches. I think of the man from the camera. Jenny, my sister's doppelganger. How many others, stretching back in an unbroken line to when our ancestors first dreamed of devils, and now I am the latest link in that chain. The freshest meat for the grinder. I feel a numb relief that I told no one where I was going, left no clues that could draw the unwary into my blighted orbit. Perhaps that small grace will be the only good to ever again come of my existence. The last tattered shreds of what was once Matt Hawkins sink beneath the churning depths of the primordial nightmare wearing his skin. He goes gently, a sigh in dead air, a mote swallowed by shadow. There is only the creature now, and the endless hunt stretching out before it in a smear of blood and darkness. It throws back its head, my head, and laughs. A wet, chittering sound, like beetles scuttling over bone. Then it lopes into the waiting tree line, a wraith of mist and malice eager to try on its new meat suit. Behind it, forgotten on the forest floor, the knife lies in a widening pool of stagnant blood, the only marker of a soul forever lost. A battle fought and lost in this haunted hollow. The pines keep their ancient counsel, indifferent witnesses to the small tragedy played out in their shadows. They will bear mute witness to 1,000 more, in the fullness of time. In their rattling branches the whispers never cease. Dark and sibilant and cruel, Rusthead. Skin taker, Keelut Quagut. It is as it has always been, as it shall ever be. The icy Alaskan wind bit at my exposed skin as I trudged through the deep snow. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face, trying to block out the cold. As a park ranger, I was used to being out in the remote wilderness alone, but something felt different this time. An uneasy feeling crept over me like I was being watched. I had set out early this morning to try to locate a group of hikers who had failed to return to base camp 2 days ago. This area of the park was vast and untamed, with dense forests stretching for miles in every direction. It would be easy to get turned around out here and lose your way. As I walked, scanning the trees for any signs of the missing group, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The forest was oddly quiet. No bird calls or skittering of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie stillness broken only by the crunch of my boots in the crusted snow. After a few hours of steady hiking, I stopped to take a water break and check my map. According to my route, I should be nearing the area where the hikers had planned to set up their backcountry camp. But as I looked around, nothing seemed familiar. The towering pines all looked the same, their snow-laden branches blocking out the weak winter sun. A twig snapped somewhere off to my left and I whirled around, my hand going instinctively to the bear spray on my belt. My eyes scanned the shadows between the trees, but I saw no movement, just the same unsettling stillness. Shaking off my unease, I repacked my bag and continued on. As a park ranger, I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. I had a job to do, find those lost hikers and get them to safety. Still, I couldn't ignore the prickling feeling on the back of my neck, the sense that I was no longer alone out here in the vast Alaskan wilderness. Something was watching me from the dark spaces between the ancient towering trees. I could feel it, and deep down I knew this would be no ordinary search and rescue mission. There was a malevolent presence out here, something unnatural. I just prayed I had the strength to face whatever horrors this frozen forest had in store. The light was beginning to fade as I crested a rise and spotted a narrow valley below, a frozen river snaking through its center. I paused, pulling out my binoculars to survey the area. There, on the far bank, I spotted a flash of color that looked out of place amidst the whites and grays of the winter landscape. Focusing in, I could make out what looked like a tent, half buried in snow. My spirits lifted at this first sign of the missing hikers. I quickened my pace, following the course of the river as I made my way down into the valley. But as I approached the camp, something caught my eye that made me stop short. About 20 yards from the tent, the pristine snow was marred by a set of tracks. They were unlike anything I had seen before. Too big to be a wolf or coyote, and the shape was strange, almost human-like, but with long, gnarled toes. The stride pattern didn't make sense for any animal I knew of. A chill that had nothing to do with the icy air ran through me. I followed the tracks with my eyes to the edge of the forest. There, I saw several broken branches, almost as if something large had crashed through the underbrush. But there was no sign of any animal, or where the tracks continued on the other side. They just suddenly ended at the tree line. "You look lost, Ranger," a voice suddenly called out, startling me. I turned to see an old native man standing on the riverbank behind me. He was dressed in furs and his weathered face was creased with age. "I'm looking for a group of missing hikers," I said cautiously, unsure where he had come from. "Have you seen anyone out here?" The old man's dark eyes flicked to the strange tracks, then back to me. "These woods are not safe. There are things here that should not be disturbed." "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He just shook his head. "The hikers you seek are beyond help now. You should leave this place, Ranger, while you still can." With that, he turned and began walking back the way he had come. I called out after him, but he didn't acknowledge me, just continued on until he disappeared from view around a bend in the river. An icy trickle of fear ran down my spine. I hurried over to the tent and peered inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags rumpled as if the occupants had left in a hurry. I spotted one of the hikers' backpacks and rifled through it, finding a logbook. Flipping it open to the last entry, I read, "Something is stalking us. We can hear it at night circling the camp. It sounds like an animal, but it also sounds like a human voice, whispering. We're leaving to try to hike back out to the trailhead. Pray for us." The entry cut off abruptly, the pen trailing off in a jagged line as if the writer had been interrupted. A wave of dread washed over me. What had happened to them? What horror was lurking in this frigid wilderness? I slowly became aware of the complete silence surrounding me. No wind, no distant bird calls. Even the coursing of the river seemed muffled. It was as if the entire forest was collectively holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it. A soft rustle, like something moving through the trees just out of sight. I scanned the edge of the forest, my heart pounding. At first I saw nothing. Then, for a split second, I glimpsed a face peering out from behind a tree trunk, but it wasn't quite a human face. The features were distorted, the skin around the mouth split in a jagged line as if sliced open, and it smiled at me, a horrifying grin full of sharp teeth. I blinked and it was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. The lost hiker's warning echoed in my mind. Leave this place. I shouldered my pack and began to hike in the direction of the setting sun, praying I could find my way out of this nightmarish forest before whatever was hunting me closed in. Night fell swiftly, the weak northern light blotted out by a sea of towering pines that stretched endlessly in every direction. I continued hiking, trying to follow the river, hoping it would lead me back towards the trailhead. But with each passing minute, my surroundings grew more disorienting. I could no longer see the mountains I had been using as landmarks, just an ocean of shadowy tree trunks in every direction. Fear began to take hold, an icy fist clenching in my gut. I was lost. Darkness pressed in all around me, so thick it felt suffocating. My headlamp cast a pitiful, wavering orb of light that only seemed to accentuate the gloom beyond. As I stumbled through a tangle of underbrush, I suddenly heard it. A long, undulating howl, rising over the vastness of the forest before fading into silence. It sounded like a wolf, but deeper, more guttural, than beneath the animalistic howl. I thought I detected the haunting cadence of words, a human voice, twisted and multi-layered, as if a person was screaming in unison with a beast. The howl rose again, sounding closer now. My heartbeat roared in my ears. I broke into a clumsy run, tripping over protruding roots and snow-hidden obstacles. Branches whipped my face and the frigid air seared my lungs, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear crashing in the underbrush behind me, as if something huge was forcing its way through the foliage, coming for me. I burst into a small clearing and stumbled to an abrupt halt, gasping. There, half buried in the snow, was a backpack, and a few feet away a hiking boot lying on its side. About a dozen paces further on, I saw another boot, as if someone had been running for their life and had their feet ripped off stride. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. I swung my light towards it, and my blood turned to ice. A pair of eyes flashed in the beam. Not animal eyes, but not quite human either. They reflected the light back at me, glowing in eerie green-white. A twig snapped off to my right and I whirled. There, in the shadows between two pines, I saw the hulking silhouette of something bipedal, but far too tall to be a man. And next to it, another set of those horrible glowing eyes. They had me surrounded. I was the prey, being driven to exhaustion by cunning hunters. How long before they closed in for the kill? Terror urged me to keep running, but I knew it was futile. I had to rest, try to regroup, and strategize some way out of this nightmare. Spotting a dense copse of pines, their branches growing together to form a partial shelter, I lunged for them. Falling to my knees, I hastily unrolled my sleeping bag and burrowed into it, as if the thin nylon could shield me. Around me, the night forest came alive with rustling and snapping twigs, eerie whispers and muffled breathing, the sounds of predators surrounding their prey. Shaking, I clutched my bear spray and stared with wide eyes into the darkness, knowing that sleep would not find me this night. The horrifying howl rose again, reverberating through the trees, and beneath it I could clearly make out a guttural voice, hissing a single word. Ranger? Time lost all meaning as I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of movement in the forest around me. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The strange tracks, the distorted face in the trees, those awful glowing eyes, and the voices beneath the howls hissing my name. None of it seemed possible. And yet the icy fear flooding my veins was all too real. Every rustle of pine needles, every snap of a twig, sent jolts of panic through me. They were out there, watching, waiting. As the long, frigid night dragged on, I found myself straining my ears, dreading the sounds of approach but almost wishing for them for any break to the torturous anticipation. But the hunters toying with me were patient. They knew I was trapped, that there was nowhere for me to run. So they took their time, savoring my growing terror. Towards dawn, when the eastern sky had begun to lighten to a deep cobalt, I started awake from a restless doze. For a moment I couldn't place what had pulled me from my exhausted stupor. Then I heard it again, a soft crunch of snow, the whisper of pine needles brushing against nylon. Something was right outside my makeshift shelter. No, not something. Someone. I could hear the unmistakable sound of human breathing, slow and deliberate. And then a voice spoke, so close it sounded like it was coming from right next to my ear inside the sleeping bag. Ranger, it hissed, drawing out the syllables in a grotesque parody of human speech. Come out and play. I bit my lip hard to keep from screaming, tasting blood in my mouth. My heart battered against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some sort of awful nightmare. There was a soft, slithering sound, like something being dragged over the snow. Then the voice came again, this time from the opposite side of the copse. Aren't you cold, Ranger? It mocked. All alone, lost in the deep woods? A wretched, hissing laugh, devoid of any human warmth or humor. You shouldn't be here. These woods belong to us. Suddenly, my sleeping bag was yanked from my shaking hands, twisted claws shredding through the insulated fabric. I cried out in horror as a hideous face thrust itself towards me, human and yet horribly alien. Its features were warped by some inner evil, a monstrousness that defied nature. Bony spurs jutted from its jaws and its teeth glinted like daggers in the faint pre-dawn light. With a terrified scream, I lurched away, grabbing for my pack. I ran into the dark woods blindly, mindless with fear, just knowing I had to get away from that awful face, those horrible hissing voices dripping with malice and inhuman hunger. But even as I fled, gasping and stumbling through the deep snow, I could hear them pursuing me. Snow crunching under heavy, loping strides, the brush of muscular bodies forcing their way between twisted trunks and low-hanging branches. The sun began to rise, its pale light slanting down through gaps in the pine boughs. But it brought no relief, only stark revelation of new horrors. There, on a tree trunk, a splatter of crimson blood still oozing. Further on, a scrap of torn fabric clinging to a broken branch. Pieces of the missing hikers, proof that I wasn't the first prey they'd hunted through this nightmarish forest. I ran until I thought my pounding heart would burst, but still the sounds of pursuit followed me, never quite catching up but never falling far enough behind to give me any hope of escape. I was trapped in a cruel game of cat and mouse, the hunters toying with their prey until exhaustion overcame me and they could close in for the kill. I prayed to see a break in the trees, a distant cabin, any sign of potential refuge. But there was nothing. Only the endless forest stretching in all directions, blanketed with deceptive white snow that hid all manner of unspeakable secrets. Finally, my legs gave out and I collapsed against a broad pine trunk, my chest heaving. This is it, I thought. This is where I die, torn apart by creatures that shouldn't exist outside of dark legends and campfire tales. I fumbled for the bear spray holstered on my belt. A pathetic defense, but all I had left. Tears burned my eyes as I unscrewed the safety cap, knowing it would make no difference. I was utterly alone, wounded prey just waiting for the fangs to sink into my flesh and the claws to rip and tear. The soft crunch of snow behind me. A huff of breath, reeking of blood and decay. I turned slowly, trembling, to face my fate. And then I saw it, stepping out from behind a tree. Terrible and obscenely wrong in the early morning light. No natural beast, but an abomination wearing a grotesque parody of human skin, as if God had molded a person out of rotten flesh and filled it with a devil's heart. It grinned at me, mouth splitting its face in a leering Glasgow smile, and raised a clawed hand. Found you, it hissed, and then it lunged. I stumbled back, a scream tearing from my throat as the creature's claws raked across my jacket. I frantically sprayed a wild stream of bear mace at its contorted face. The thing shrieked, a horrific guttural sound of pain and fury as it clawed at its eyes. I didn't wait to see if the mace had stopped it. I turned and ran, sprinting through the snow-laden pines. Adrenaline lent speed to my exhausted legs, panic rising in my throat with each gasping breath. It knew exactly where I was now. The hunt had begun in earnest. All around me, the forest came alive with menacing shadows and eerie rustling noises, hidden things moving unseen between the endless skeletal tree trunks. I had the horrifying sense of being herded, driven like a wounded deer before howling hounds. Always there were glimpses of motions in my peripheral vision, dark shapes keeping pace with me, loping and bounding through the thick underbrush to my sides. The thing wearing corrupted human form crashed through the foliage behind me, roaring its pain and bloodlust. An answering howl rose to my right, and I sobbed in hopeless terror. There was more than one of them. Of course there was. Wolves always hunted in packs, but these were not wolves. Not any more than the twisted thing behind me was a man. My mind shrieked a name for them. One whispered around campfires by the Yupik people for generations, Kag Talin, the Skinwalkers. Shamans driven mad with evil, transformed into monstrous beasts, neither animal nor human. Hungry and soulless, driven to hunt and slay and devour. How arrogant, how foolish I had been, thinking I could conquer this pitiless wilderness armed with only my wits and modern tools. The sheer hubris of man to believe we had any true dominion here. This ancient forest tolerated our presence, nothing more. It had secrets and nightmares we couldn't begin to comprehend. The trees began to thin, and I stumbled out into a clearing, nearly weeping with relief when I spotted a small ramshackle cabin on the far side. Salvation, shelter, a place to hide or maybe even find a weapon to defend myself. I put on a last burst of speed, lunging through the knee-deep snow towards that dilapidated structure. Behind me, the heavy footfalls of my pursuers grew louder, spurring me on. I didn't dare look back, certain that if I did, I would see them burst into the open, all fangs and claws and malevolent glowing eyes. I hit the cabin door with my shoulder, praying it wasn't locked. The rotted wood gave way and I practically fell inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I scrambled to my feet, casting around wildly for something, anything to brace against the splintered boards. The interior was dark and musty, lit only by thin shafts of gray light filtering in through chinks in the walls. A thick layer of undisturbed dust coated every surface, muting my frantic footsteps. My heart hammered against my ribs as I shoved a heavy wooden table against the door, then dragged an old bookcase over to further barricade it. Outside, I could hear the rustle and thud of heavy bodies moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. Claws scraped down the outer walls, and a low, eerie whine seeped in through the gaps, setting my teeth on edge and sending icy tendrils of fear down my spine. They had me cornered like a rat in a trap. It was only a matter of time before they broke in and tore me to shreds. A wounded sob escaped my chattering teeth, and I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle the pathetic sound. I had to get a grip, find a way to survive. With shaking hands, I dug through my pack for my flashlight. In the wavering beam, I glimpsed a rickety ladder leading up to a loft. A plan formed in my panicked mind. I could buy myself a little time at least. A defensible position. I found the trapdoor in the loft floor and swung it open to reveal a tiny attic crawl space. Dragging myself up inside, I pulled the hatch shut behind me, plunging myself into complete darkness. There I lay on my belly in the cramped space, hardly daring to breathe, my cheek pressed to rough, splintery boards that smelled of rot and mildew. Below me, I heard the cabin door splinter and crack, then the heavy thud of footsteps. They were inside, a rasping, snuffling sound, as of some large predator scenting for prey. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Thick claws scraped across floorboards, circling, searching. Then the ladder creaked, protesting under sudden weight. Oh God, it was coming up. I pressed my forehead to the dusty floor and wept silently, realizing I had only prolonged the inevitable. There was no escape. The Skinwalkers had me. The trapdoor in the loft floor began to rattle as something heavy pushed up against it from below. My heart seized in my chest and I scrabbled backwards desperately in the cramped crawl space, putting a few more precious inches between myself and the splintering wood. Ancient hinges screamed in protest as the hatch started to lift, and a rancid smell washed over me like rotting meat left to fester in the sun. I could hear the eager panting of the beast on the other side, the soft snarls that made my skin crawl with revulsion and terror. Desperate, my hand closed around something hard and oddly shaped in the darkness. I pulled it towards me, about to hurl it at the lifting trapdoor, but froze when my questing fingers brushed against unmistakable features. the empty eye sockets and bared teeth of a human skull. I recoiled with a sharp gasp, and in the thin shaft of gray light from below, I saw that the crawl space was littered with bones. Femurs, rib cages, skeletal arms reaching in macabre postures, the missing hikers, previous victims, all the lost souls that had been claimed by these nightmare woods. The trapdoor crashed open and the snarling skinwalker started to force its bulk through the gap. In sheer, mind-blanking panic, I grabbed the skull and hurled it at the thing. The bone struck its misshapen head with a sickening crack and it reeled back with an enraged howl. I didn't hesitate. I launched myself forward and kicked out with both legs, slamming the hatch closed on the creature's grasping taloned fingers. I heard bones snap and it bellowed in pain, jerking back. The trapdoor slammed shut and I threw myself on top of it, fumbling to re-engage the iron latch with violently trembling hands. Below me, the thing raged and thrashed, hurling its weight against the aged wood again and again. But the door held, if only just barely. For the moment, I had bought myself a temporary reprieve. In the faint light leaking in through gaps in the roof shingles, I cautiously examined the grim cache scattered around me. Bones, yes, clawed clean of flesh and cracked open to reach the marrow. But other things too, scraps of tattered, bloody clothing, a hiker's boot with the ankle bones still trapped inside, shredded backpacks spilling desiccated trail mix and maps, and there, glinting dully amidst the gruesome debris, a worn leather-bound journal. With shaking fingers, I pried apart the blood-stained pages and tilted it towards the thin light. At first, I couldn't make out the faded, spidery script, but as I squinted at the cramped handwriting, a few words leapt out at me. Wendigo psychosis, Navajo skinwalker legends, consumption of human flesh, possession by evil spirits. Cold horror washed over me as I read the increasingly disjointed account, a story of starvation in an unforgiving wilderness, of a man driven to the unspeakable to survive, of the corruption of body and soul. The author had been studying folklore and mythology in remote communities. He had never imagined the nightmares would follow him home to his own hunting cabin. The final page was a hastily scrawled message in shaky script. I see their eyes in the trees watching me. The hunger never abates. It gnaws and yowls inside me, driving me mad. The whispering shadows call me to the hunt. God help me, I cannot fight the beast within much longer. There the journal ended abruptly, the pages stained rusty brown. As I sat, numb with horror and hopelessness, the trapdoor gave an ominous groan. Wood cracked and splintered as talons raked across the other side. The skinwalkers had not given up. They would never give up, not while warm flesh was tantalizingly within reach. I was only prolonging my own torment by delaying the inevitable. I let my head fall back against the rough wall and loosed a long, shuddering breath. Outside, the wind picked up, making the cabin creak and moan like a living thing. Snow started to fall from the leaden sky, tiny flakes dancing and twirling as they descended to blanket the earth in deceptive, concealing white. There would be no escape, no rescue. Only gnashing teeth in the darkness and eternal, unyielding cold. The grim secrets of this place would bury me, the hungry forest devouring all sign that I had ever existed. And in my final moments, as the trapdoor finally gave way with a shriek of anguished wood, I thought I could hear the wind howling my name, whispering seductive promises. Let go, it crooned. Stop fighting, become one with the wild dark. Embrace the beast within. Then they were upon me, jaws slavering and eyes alight with feral hunger. And as talons pierced my flesh and hot blood gushed across cold boards, I swear I saw my own face grinning back at me from that twisting, writhing mass of corrupted shadows. My mouth split wide in a rictus of mad, triumphant glee. I felt my flesh tear, a sudden shocking burst of agony as talons raked my side. I screamed high and desperate, the pain ripping the sound from my throat. Hot blood gushed between my fingers as I futilely tried to staunch the flow. The stench of it, coppery and thick, mingled with the fetid reek of the creatures. They crouched over me, all malevolent eyes and gnashing teeth and hideous, distorted faces. I could see the traces of their stolen humanity in those grotesque visages, remnants of the people they had once been before succumbing to this profane curse. Please, I gasped out, my voice a thready, blood-bubbled croak. Please don't, I'm not one of you. Hissing laughter, cruel and devoid of any mercy or reason. You will be, rasped the largest one, its jaws splitting unnaturally wide to reveal a double row of serrated teeth. The hunger will take you, as it takes us all. There is no fighting it. No. I shook my head wildly, tears mixing with the blood on my face. I won't. I'll die before I become that. Its ruined lips peeled back from those monstrous teeth in a vicious parody of a smile. Oh, you will die, little ranger, but the beast will rise. It is the way of things here. Despair crushed my chest like a physical weight. To become one of them, a depraved creature stalking these shadowed woods, it was a fate far worse than death. I thought of the missing hikers, the bones littering this foul den. How many of them had been driven to the same awful fate, consumed and corrupted by this insatiable evil? The skinwalker placed one taloned hand over my shredded abdomen, and I cried out in breathless agony, feeling the blood loss dragging me towards oblivion. My vision swam dizzyingly, narrowing to a dim tunnel. This was it. The grim, ignoble end of my story, just another pile of ravaged bones in this forsaken place. As if from a great distance, I heard an eerie, ululating howl rise outside the cabin, answered by another and then another, the chilling chorus rising in dreadful harmony. The pack was calling to each other, and to me, welcoming me. No, I breathed again, the word a mere thready wisp of sound. From somewhere deep inside, I felt a flicker of something I had thought long extinguished. Hope. Faint and guttering, but still stubbornly clinging to life. Like me, I reached one trembling, blood-slicked hand up to grasp the amulet at my throat, a parting gift from the old Yupik shaman who had tried to warn me what fate awaited in these woods. He had pressed it into my palm, dark eyes grave and sad. When the time comes, he murmured, when all hope seems lost, remember who you are. My fingers closed around the carved bone fetish, and I drew in a rattling breath that seared my lungs. Then, putting every last ounce of my fading strength behind it, I heaved myself upward and slammed my head into the skinwalker's face. The creature reeled back with a startled yelp, more surprise than pain. But it was enough. I rolled to my hands and knees, adrenaline granting me a burst of pure, desperate energy. I scrabbled for the trapdoor, dragging my mangled body across the bloody boards, shrieks of outrage and the scrabble of claws on wood. They were after me, enraged by my defiance. I half fell, half tumbled down the ladder, landing in a crumpled heap on the floor below. Pain exploded through me, my vision whiting out for a terrifying eternity. Somehow I found my feet, lurching in a drunken stagger towards the cabin door. Behind me, heavy thuds as the skinwalkers dropped down from the loft. I crashed through the door, barely feeling the sting of the frigid air on my skin. I ran, shambling and reeling like a thing already half dead. The trees seemed to twist and writhe around me, reaching out, grasping branches to clutch at my clothes. Snow swirled down in wind-driven sheets, blinding and disorienting. I had no idea where I was going, no plan except to put distance between myself and the nightmares snapping at my heels. From behind, enraged howls pierced the night. They were coming. I could hear the pound of running feet, the crash of underbrush, chasing me down like the wounded prey I was. A strangled sob escaped me, and I pushed myself harder, the last dregs of my strength fueled by pure animal terror. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out all other sound. I barely felt the icy wind lashing my face, the branches that raked across my skin. There was only the next step, and the next, and the next, until, between one stride and another, the ground simply vanished beneath my feet. I flailed my arms, a scream rising in my throat as I pitched forward into empty air. I toppled head over heels down a steep embankment, a tangle of limbs and ragged cries. Sharp rocks and broken branches battered me as I rolled and bounced, my beleaguered body utterly ragdoll limp, an explosion of blinding pain. Then a sensation of icy coldness swallowing me whole. I had fallen into a narrow but deep ravine, choked with snowdrifts. The wind howled overhead, the tortured moan of it echoing off the steep rock walls to either side. I lay there stunned, the snow beneath me slowly turning crimson as my life seeped out. For a long moment, I simply drifted, too exhausted and hurt to move. The snow felt almost warm against my skin now, a soft embrace that urged me to let go, to slip into that seductive dark and leave the pain behind. It would be easy, so very easy. Just close my eyes and stop fighting. Overhead, a flicker of movement caught my fading attention. I lulled my head to the side and saw dark shapes materialize at the lip of the ravine, silhouetted against the leaden sky. The skinwalkers. They peered down at me, eyes flashing with feral green fire, jaws hanging open in eager pants. One lifted its head and loosed an eerie yipping cry, a sound of dark triumph. It had run me to ground at last. Now it would feast on my flesh and corrupt what remained of my soul. I would rise as one of them, a twisted creature of the hungering dark. I felt the traitor thoughts slither through my battered mind. To give in, to let the change take me, an end to fighting and fear and pain. It would be a sort of peace in its way. Then I heard a voice, as clear and cold as the winter wind. Remember who you are. My fingers tightened reflexively around the shaman's amulet, still somehow clutched in my fist. I forced my eyes open, locking gazes with the lead skinwalker above. "No," I croaked out, barely audible. Not one of you." I began dragging myself through the snowdrift, every inch a sheer agony that sent bolts of white-hot torment radiating through my broken, savaged body. The skinwalkers shrieked in rage and started clambering down the rocky slope, talons gouging into stone. The ravine curved ahead, disappearing around a sharp bend. If I could just reach it, put it between myself and my pursuers. The last 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles, but I used my elbows, my knees, my chin, hauling myself forward with all the desperate strength I had left, a trail of smeared scarlet in my wake. My heart thundered, breaths coming in short, agonized gasps that bubbled wetly in my chest. I knew some of my wounds were mortal. I was racing my own dying body as much as the monsters behind me. But if I could just hold on a little longer. The skinwalkers hit the ravine floor, howls echoing like hell itself. I could smell their rank breath, stinking of rotten meat and decay. Then talons sank into my calf and I arched in breathless anguish. "Mine?" the creature snarled, even as it began dragging me backwards. I scrabbled frantically at the snow, fingernails breaking, trying to find purchase. But it was too strong. I slid back, inch by terrible inch, mewling through my clenched teeth. This was it, the end. Then, beyond my tormentor, I saw it. A pale smudge of light seeping down from above. Dawn, growing brighter by the second as the sun crested the horizon behind me. The frigid Alaskan air bit at my exposed skin as I hiked alone through the dense spruce forest. I had been a park ranger in the backcountry of Denali for over a decade, but today felt different. An unsettling stillness filled the woods, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch under the heavy late October snow. I was on my way to investigate reports of missing hikers near Sunken Island Lake, deep in a remote corner of the park. In all my years, I had never known travelers to journey that far off trail, especially this late in the season. Something felt wrong. A tingle crept up my neck as I sensed watchful eyes upon me. I quickened my pace, eager to find the lost souls and return them to safety. As I trekked deeper into the wilderness, the towering evergreens seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Despite the brightening dawn, shadows lingered between the time-worn trunks, concealing unknown threats. I shook off my growing unease, attributing it to the lack of human sounds in the usually lively forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and foul lurked just beyond sight. Stopping to consult my map, I noticed an odd series of marks scratched into a nearby aspen. Jagged lines and cryptic symbols, clearly not made by any animal I knew of. The hairs on my arm stood on end. Who or what had left this unsettling message? I traced the lines with a gloved finger, puzzling over their meaning. A twig snapped in the undergrowth behind me. I spun around, reaching for the bear spray at my hip, but there was nothing, just a lazy swirl of snowflakes drifting to the spongy earth. Chuckling at my paranoia, I forged ahead, leaning into the steep incline of the hillside. As I climbed, I tried to ignore the sensation of being watched, of malevolent eyes studying my every move. I told myself it was just the overactive imagination of a weary ranger, but deep down I knew the truth. There was something out here in the primordial Alaskan wilds, something that didn't want me to find those missing hikers. As I crested the ridge and gazed out at the sprawling expanse of wilderness ahead, I swallowed the lump of dread rising in my throat. I had a sinking feeling I was heading into the heartland of an evil older than the ancient glaciers. With a deep breath, I descended the far side of the slope, determined to learn the forest's sinister secret. The icy mist swirled around my boots as I knelt to examine the tracks. I had been expecting signs of the missing hikers, perhaps the tread of their hiking boots or the plastic teeth of their snowshoes, but these imprints were different. They were too large to have been made by any human foot, but lacked the distinctive characteristics of bear, wolf, or wolverine. If I didn't know better, I'd say they almost looked like the bare footprints of some lanky giant. I followed the unsettling trail as it wove between boulders and overfallen logs. It seemed to be heading towards Sunken Island Lake with uncanny directness, as if whatever left them knew exactly where it wanted to go. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get reinforcements, but I had a job to do. I had to find those hikers. As I rounded a bend in the path, I stopped short. Ahead of me stood a grizzled old native man, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden staff. He looked like part of the forest itself, with lichen-encrusted clothes and a face creased like weathered bark. I had met a few of the local Atna tribe on my patrols, but never this far out in the backcountry. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice gravelly. "This is a bad place, an old place." He swept his arm towards the brooding trees. "The Kushtaka walks these woods." I furrowed my brow. "The Kushtaka? I've never heard of it." The old man spat on the ground, as if the very name left a foul taste. "Shapeshifter. A wicked thing born of angered spirits. It tricks you, mimics voices of loved ones, lures you off the path." A chill ran down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. The strange tracks, the sense of being watched. Could there really be something supernatural at work? I shook my head. I was a park ranger, a woman of science. I didn't have time for native superstitions. "Thanks for the warning, but I have missing people to find." I walked past him, continuing down the winding path. "Turn back," the old man called after me, "before it steals your skoe." I had no idea what a sko was, and I didn't intend to find out. But as I forged ahead, doubt crept in. There was something unnatural about these woods, a menacing aura that pressed down on me. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of the hikers. Then I saw it, just for a second. A flash of leathery skin between the branches, like a humanoid shape cloaked in patchwork hides. It was there and gone in an instant, leaving me questioning my own senses. I quickened my pace, heart thudding against my ribs. The afternoon shadows already seemed to be deepening, an unfriendly darkness gathering between the sentinel pines. I was beginning to feel less like the hunter and more like the hunted with each passing step. And for the first time in my long career, I was gripped by the unmistakable sense that I was no longer alone in the vast Alaskan wild. The weak northern sun slipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the forest into premature twilight. I had been walking for hours, my legs burning with fatigue, but Sunken Island Lake was still nowhere in sight. The utter lack of any human trace gnawed at me. No litter, no broken branches, not even the distant sound of voices bouncing off sheer cliffs. Just primordial stillness broken only by my labored breaths. I consulted my map again, trying to get my bearings, but the landscape refused to align with the contour lines. It was as if the wilderness itself was shifting, leading me in circles. A cold sweat beaded on my brow despite the deepening chill. I was lost. As I staggered forward, strange noises echoed from the pitch-black woods encasing the trail. Guttural snarls that could have been a predator claiming its territory. Mournful wails that sounded heart-wrenchingly human. And beneath it all, a constant rustling, like something large slithering through the undergrowth. I found my hand straying to the bear spray at my belt with increasing frequency. My headlamp scythed through the inky blackness, picking out twisting branches and tumbled boulders that seemed to contort into unsettling shapes in the pixelated shadows. That's when I saw it. A torn piece of fluorescent fabric fluttering from a bone-white branch, an REI tent stuff sack. With numb fingers I unclipped it from the tree, heart clenching at the unmistakable brown stains spotting the rip. Blood. Old but not old enough. I swung my illuminated gaze around the area, picking up other disturbing signs. A single hiking boot, the sole worn, ragged, tangled scraps of a North Face parka snarled in the bushes. A crushed pair of wire-rimmed glasses. A story began to take shape in my mind, and it was a story I had witnessed all too many times. The story of hikers, woefully unprepared for the merciless Alaskan backcountry, pushed past their limits, hurt, exposed, but as I bent to examine the jerky teeth marks gouged into the rubber sole of the boot, another darker narrative emerged. This was no mere misadventure. Something had happened to these hikers, something terrible, and like a whisper on the frigid wind, I heard the old Atna man's words again. The Kushtaka walks these woods. Every hair on my body stood on end. I snatched the fines with trembling hands and staggered on, no longer certain if I was heading towards my truck or just plunging deeper into the wilderness's malevolent heart. As the darkness thickened to a suffocating blackness, I knew I had no choice. I would have to make camp, wait for daylight, and pray that the horrors that claimed those hikers wouldn't find me too. With mounting anxiety, I slipped off my pack, reaching in for my tent. But my fingers brushed against something soft and pulpy. I yanked my hand back as if burned. Slowly, not wanting to see but unable to look away, I unzipped the compartment. The shredded remains of my food bag sat in a sticky red puddle, the unmistakable metallic tang of blood flooding my nostrils. My scream ricocheted through the watching trees. I didn't remember setting up my tent. The last clear memory was of that stomach-churning discovery, the blood-soaked scraps of my provisions painting gruesome abstract swirls on the forest floor. Everything after was a fear-shrouded haze of trembling hands fumbling with tent poles. The zipper's tomb-like finality as I sealed myself into the gossamer cocoon. Now I crouched in the claustrophobic nylon dome, headlamp off to avoid drawing attention, quaking as unknown things went bump in the eternal night. Each rustle of evergreen boughs morphed into stalking footsteps. Each ululating siren wail of the wind became a chorus of agonized human screams. There was no differentiating real threats from imagined, not anymore. In the span of a day, the forest had transformed from sanctuary to purgatory. Rationally, I knew my mind was just conjuring ghoulish visions out of fatigue and stress. But another part, an ancient reptilian core, insisted the danger was real. That watchful presence I had sensed all day had finally caught up to me. I could feel it prowling the perimeter of my flimsy shelter, padding on softly malicious feet, shushing the terrain into unnatural silence with its very wrongness. A creature that didn't belong but had made this place its vile domain. I strained my ears, paranoia mounting with each amplified rustle, until I caught it, a sticky squelching like a sneaker pulling free of viscous muck. And then again, and again. Approaching, my sleeping bag became a suffocating prison, the slightest crinkle of shifting down as deafening as a gunshot. I was afraid to even breathe. Maybe if I didn't move, didn't make a sound, it would pass me by, find some other victim to torment. Outside, the repulsive suction cup footfalls grew closer. The thin nylon wall began to deform inwards, as if probed by invisible fingers. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I silently prayed to a god I hadn't spoken to since childhood. Then, from mere inches beyond the tent fly, a guttural voice straight out of hell itself. "Ranger!" I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth creaked, willing myself not to scream. "I know you're in there, Ranger. I can smell your fear, taste your sweat." The sibilant whisper slithered through my very core. How was this possible? What monstrosity could speak like a human? "Come out, Ranger. Your supplies are already spoiled. Why fight it? The forest is patient. The forest is hungry." White-hot terror seared my veins. It knew. The tampering, the missing food, it was all this thing's doing. Some impossibly cunning predator stalking me. A fresh wave of dread crested as the gravity of my situation sank in. I was marooned in an endless stretch of wilderness with no food, no way to call for help, and something that wanted to do so much worse than kill me lurking in the abyss beyond this pathetic scrap of nylon. The depressions vanished from the wall. I heard the squishing steps start to circle my tent, slow and deliberate. "Ranger, oh Ranger," it sing-songed, voice now saccharine as poisoned honey. "You can't hide forever. Stay in your flimsy den. Grow weak. Wither. We have all the time in the world." As quickly as they had come, the footsteps oozed into silence. For a moment I just lay there, still trembling. Then all the terror locks broke and I began to sob, gasping and heaving. There would be no dawn for me. Only this endless void and the patient eternal hunger in the dark. The night never ended. Seconds ticked into centuries as I lay paralyzed in my sweat-soaked sleeping bag, every muscle wire taut, ears pricked for the slightest anomaly beyond the buffeting gusts. But all remained still. No ooze of repugnant footsteps, no guttural lullabies. Despite my vigilance, I must have dozed off, because when a titanic crack jolted me back to consciousness, the anemic rays of the Arctic sun were just beginning to infiltrate the dense weave. On wobbly knees, I slithered from my dank cocoon. The forest was washed in insipid gray, the snow dingy like graveyard dirt. No birdsong piped from skeletal branches. No squirrels foraged in the drifts. Just an oppressive silence, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. The events of the night came flooding back in a noxious wave. Had it really happened? Had some demon actually sought me out, threatened me from beyond the flimsy veil? Or was it all some trauma-induced hallucination? The invention of an overwrought mind. Swaying, I staggered over to my campsite. A strangled cry escaped my chapped lips, echoing forlornly off the indifferent trunks. My tent had collapsed in on itself. Support poles snapped like kindling. Shredded nylon fluttered in the Arctic gale. It was then I saw them, the enormous, misshapen tracks ringing the destroyed structure. Not human, not animal. Something other. Something wrong. Icy claws dug into my heart. It was all true. And that meant the other truth. The horrible truth was undeniable. That thing was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Panic surged, white-hot and blinding. I had to move. Now, I lunged for my mangled pack, snatching up anything still usable with violently shaking hands. The creature's fetid words slithered through my brain like sewage. Stay in your flimsy den. Grow weak. Wither. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't succumb to this psychopathic forest. I had to keep going, get to civilization, warn people about the malevolent entity stalking the backcountry. Shouldering my lumpy bag, I plunged down what I prayed was the path back towards humanity. At first I tried to keep my pace measured, cautious. Hypothermia was as deadly as any cryptid. But with every skirling wind, every rime-encrusted branch that reached out hungrily, my composure cracked. Soon I was hurtling through the frosty underbrush, a terrified animal fleeing an unseen predator. Sweat poured down my neck. My heart battered against my ribcage. And all the while I could feel its presence shadowing me through the claustrophobic pines, never quite revealing itself. A shape launched from behind a hillock. A flash of mottled fur. 2 points of glinting bone. I threw myself to the side with a yelp, scrabbling backwards on the permafrost. But when I blinked, the apparition was gone. Just a trick of the light, or so I desperately wanted to believe. The next horror stepped out from behind a grandfather spruce. A man this time, wearing a ranger's uniform, his face a jigsaw of ruptured skin. I lurched away, only to spy another human form weaving between distant boulders. A woman clad in shredded Gore-Tex, strawberry blonde hair and blood-matted ropes, one of the missing hikers. They were everywhere now, people shapes in various stages of decay, empty eyes all drilling into me with cold hunger. My brain screamed at my legs to run, but they wouldn't obey. I sank to my knees as the aberrations converged, expressionless faces looming. One reached out with a pulpy hand that ended in wicked claws. I tried to recoil, but my body remained paralyzed. The gangrenous nails caressed my cheek, traced my jawline, and then I blinked, and the nightmarish visions vanished like mist under the weak northerly sun. There was no one there. Just me, hunched and gasping in a lonely copse of spruce, the desolate Alaskan wild stretching into infinity on all sides. I pressed a quivering palm to my hammering heart, trying to slow its thunderous gallop. What was happening to me? Was this place actually haunted by some indigenous shapeshifter? Or was it all in my head? A slow descent into madness born of exhaustion, isolation, and dread. With an effort of will, I forced myself back to my feet. Real or imagined, I had to keep moving. Find shelter, make a plan. Letting the paranoia win would be a death sentence out here. Leaning into the knife-like wind, I forged ahead, trying to ignore the incessant prickle on the back of my neck that said I was being hunted. As the trees closed in like a dank maw, I reached a grim resolution. I would not be the creature's next victim. If this was to be a battle of wills, so be it. This ranger wasn't going down without a fight. The cabin materialized out of the icy murk like an oasis in the heart of despair. One minute I was lost in a world of skeletal branches grasping at me like arthritic fingers. The next I was staggering into a snow-carpeted clearing dominated by a rickety one-room structure. Chipped green paint peeled from warped clapboards. Moth-eaten curtains hung in limp knots behind grime-encrusted windows. A weather-worn sign above the door proclaimed it as the Deep Lark Ranger Station, though no ranger had likely set foot there since the Truman administration. But to my desperate eyes, it may as well have been the Ritz. A sanctuary, a defendable bulwark against the madness nipping at my heels. I trudged up the drooping porch and tried the knob. Locked. Undeterred, I slammed my shoulder against the door once, twice, finally feeling the decrepit bolt give. Icy hinges screeched as I barreled inside, quickly turning to close out the hostile wilderness. For a long moment I just leaned against the musty wood, chest heaving, adrenaline still surging like a flooding river. When the roar in my ears finally abated, I took stock of my surroundings. A sagging cot dominated one wall, its moldy mattress like a sponge. A pot-bellied stove lurked in the corner, eaten by rust, cans of ancient beans stacked haphazardly beside it. But the room's most striking feature was the bizarre tapestry that covered every inch of wall space. Hundreds of sketches, seemingly torn from a journal, plastered up with paste that had long ago hardened into yellow scabs. With a growing sense of unease, I stepped closer, examining the tortured scrawls. And my blood turned to ice. There were words, fragments of sentences repeated over and over in an unhinged cacophony. It wears many faces, a hunger older than time. We are but morsels to it. Flee, flee, flee. But far more disturbing than the words were the drawings. Bipedal figures, stooped and hungry, eyes like bleeding ink blots, creatures that were human and not human, their misshapen forms cloaked in what looked like a patchwork of human hides, and again a towering monstrosity crowned in a twisting wreath of antlers, the words Kushtaka etched below it in shaky block letters. Instinctively, I reached to touch one of the sketches. As my fingers made contact, I jerked back as if scalded. Memories not my own flooded my brain in a boiling cascade. The cabin. But not empty, not abandoned. A man, jittering hands tracing panic strokes across paper. Muttering about the defiler, the soul eater. Then, a pounding on the door, a voice, congested with rot, crooning his name. Bill. Bill Carver. The sketches falling from his hands as he backed away from the splintering wood. A scream. I snapped out of the vision, staggering back from the nightmarish tapestry. Bill Carver, the missing ranger. He had been here, in this very cabin, seen the same horrors stalking me now. And from the looks of things, he hadn't escaped with his sanity intact. A visceral dread sank its claws into my chest as I scanned the disturbing scrawls again. Was this what awaited me? A slow decline into madness as the forest and its eldritch denizen consumed me piece by piece? No. I refused to accept that fate. Gritting my teeth, I began frantically rummaging through the detritus of the abandoned cabin, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. I upended the cot, sending a cascade of desiccated mouse droppings skittering across the floor, tore through the cabinets, air thick with the reek of decay. But everywhere I turned, I found only more signs of Bill's unraveling. Feverish sketches of antlered monstrosities, garbled screeds about the soulless ones, his name repeated over and over like a prayer. Despair settled over me like a shroud. There was nothing here that could save me. No gun, no radio, not even a rusted can opener to defend myself with. Outside the feeble walls, I heard the wind rising to a banshee keen, a sound like agonized wailing riding its gusts. The cabin that had seemed a sanctuary mere moments before now felt like a flimsy trap, the logs barely more than kindling to the ravenous forest beyond. That's when I felt it. The hairs on my nape prickling to attention, stomach clenching with some primal intuition. Slowly I turned, already knowing what I would find. There, in the shadows of the farthest corner, a darkness deeper than the others, a shape tall and gnarled, unfolding from the gloom like a rotting flower. The reek of putrefaction sweet and heavy, the Kushtaka. Not outside, not circling. Here, with me. I backed away on numb legs, eyes bulging, breath catching in my throat. The thing shambled forward, antlered head scraping the low ceiling. In the guttering light, I could see its form was a patchwork of hides, deer, bear, human, all stitched together with sinew and worn like some obscene coat. Ranger, it croaked, voice wet and cloying. You found me. Hysteria bubbled up my esophagus. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg. But terror had locked an iron band around my chest. The Kushtaka cocked its head, considering me with glassy eyes that swam in ichor. Then its jaw unhinged, splitting its face like an overripe melon. From the fetid cavern of its mouth, 3 voices spoke as one. A rasping man, a wailing woman, a child's sob. Hungry, so hungry, always so hungry. It lurched another step closer. One limb, a twisted amalgam of human hand and wolf paw, extending towards my face. I could only cringe against the wall as it brushed my cheek, traced my jaw with a nail that was more talon than finger. Give us your skin, it hissed, a forked tongue flicking over needle teeth. Wear it for a while, maybe forever. White-hot terror detonated in my skull. With a scream that felt torn from my very soul, I smashed my head forward, feeling the crunch of cartilage as my forehead collided with the creature's nose. The Kushtaka reeled back, more surprised than hurt, but it was the opening I needed. I dove past its bulk, scrabbling for the door. Claws raked down my back, scoring my flesh into ribbons, but I was already yanking on the handle, ripping the entryway open with a screech of tortured wood, and then I was out, plunging into the icy wilderness, the baying of the Kushtaka nipping at my heels, into the wolf's jaws, the belly of the beast, into my last desperate bid for survival. I ran. Ran until my lungs were knives in my chest, until my heart felt like it would detonate. Ran as the unearthly howls of the Kushtaka dogged every footfall, spurring me on like cattle prods. The forest whipped by in a blur of browns and grays, individual trees losing distinction in my panic. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction anymore. Away from the creature was the only bearing I knew, but it wasn't enough. Again and again I would catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, a shambling silhouette devouring the distance between us with preternatural speed, changing forms as it came, cycling through its carousel of horrors, now an emaciated ranger, jaws yawning in a macabre smile, now a hiker, entrails spilling from a shredded belly like a perverse offering, now a twisted chimera of all the skins it had stolen, a shape-shifting grotesquerie birthed from the depths of nightmare, and beneath it all that insidious voice oozing into my skull, impossible to shut out. You can't run forever, Ranger. I will catch you, unmake you, feast on your skoe. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision. My ankle twisted on a hidden root, sending me sprawling into the crusted snow. I felt something in my legs snap, a sensation like a gunshot. I screamed but staggered upright, hobbling on. The pain was incandescent, unendurable, but the alternative, to lay down and simply wait for my fate, was so much worse. So I lurched onward, a wounded animal trailing blood across a bone-white canvas. The Kushtaka's mirth echoed from every direction, delighting in my futile struggles. I knew it was only toying with me now, a cruel cat letting its meal think it had a chance. But what else could I do? To give up was to let it win, and some vestigial flicker of human defiance refused to grant it that satisfaction. Time lost all meaning, narrowing down to a never-ending montage of torment. A step, a jolt of pain, another step. The sun was just beginning to crest over the mountains when I finally fell and knew I would not be getting up again. I had reached a small clearing, a break in the oppressive tree line. In the center, like a beacon, a weather-worn sign pointing back to civilization. But it may as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me. I crumpled against it, my mangled leg no longer obeying commands. This was the end. I could feel it in my leaden limbs, my fluttering heart. The Kushtaka knew it too. It came strolling into the clearing with a predator's nonchalance, dropping the pretense of pursuit. Such a merry chasse, little fox, it purred, its form settling into the gaunt ranger bill. But like all life, it was futile. The forest consumes all. It squatted in front of me, tilting my lolling head up with one wasted finger. I could only stare in mute horror as its face rippled, features rearranging into a new configuration. A woman, ruddy hair, green eyes dull with resignation. I knew her. She had been on my mind since I started this cursed rescue. Please, the Kushtaka said in my sister's voice. It only hurts for a moment. Then you'll be with me forever. A part of me wanted to give in. to collapse into my sister's arms and let this nightmare be over. But as I stared into those achingly familiar eyes, I saw the emptiness behind them, the soulless void. This wasn't my sister. My sister was gone. This was a skin the Kushtaka wore, another lost trophy, and I would not be added to its collection. Inch by torturous inch, I slid my hand down to my boot, wrapped my fingers around the handle of my ice pick still tucked into its sheath. The Kushtaka grinned with my sister's mouth reaching for me. I summoned the dregs of my strength, my resolve, my fury at this violation of a loved one's memory, and I swung. The pick punctured the Kushtaka's neck in a gout of black ichor. It reared back, hands clutching at the wound, shrill screams spewing from a dozen different throats. I swung again and again, opening new rents, new founts of fetid ooze. The Kushtaka's form came unstitched with each blow, unraveling into its component skins until nothing remained but a putrid heap. Choking on the stench of rot, I turned away, pulling myself to my one good foot with the signpost. I looked up at the rune carved into the aged wood, the route back to the ranger station, back to the world of the living. It may as well have been 100 miles through my wavering eyes, but it was a chance. A slim one, a desperate one, but one I would gladly take. For after staring into the face of the Kushtaka, feeling the icy breath of its hunger, even a fool's hope was a mercy. Spitting a glob of coppery saliva, I took one hobbling step, then another. Behind me, a wet, rattling inhale, a stirring of cast-off flesh. I didn't look back. I had beaten the Kushtaka. But I knew, even if I survived these woods, even if I made it back to the company of the sane and well-adjusted, I would never stop looking over my shoulder, would never stop seeing its 1,000 faces in every passing stranger, every morning fog. The Kushtaka had marked me, tasted my scent, and out here, in the wild places, there was no place beyond its reach. I had escaped the belly of the beast, but I would never truly leave this forest. It and its horrors would be with me always, waiting for their chance to finish our macabre waltz. Such is the price of meeting the Kushtaka, of matching wits and metal with the insatiable hunger in the dark. A toll measured not in flesh but in the slow erosion of the soul. As I limped off into the uncertain dawn, the creature's words echoed in my head, an insidious refrain that would never fully fade. The forest is patient, Ranger. The forest is hungry. The fog hung low and thick over the forest as I double-checked my pack one last time before setting off. Overhead, dark clouds obscured any glimpse of the sky, lending an oppressive atmosphere to the morning. As a park ranger, I was used to solo patrols in remote areas, but an inexplicable sense of unease hung over me as I trudged into the trees. I was on a mission to search for a missing hiker who had failed to return from a trip into the backcountry 3 days ago. His planned route would take him deep into a seldom visited region of the vast wilderness preserve where I worked. The hiker was experienced and well-equipped, so his disappearance was troubling. As I walked, my boots crunched on the layer of pine needles and fallen leaves blanketing the faint trail. Towering spruce and birch trees flanked me on either side, their dense foliage blocking out what little light penetrated the clouds. The air smelled strongly of damp earth and decaying vegetation. I had an eerie sense of being watched as I ventured deeper into the shadowy forest. I kept catching flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was never anything there. Just the endless trees standing in silent witness. Get it together, I chided myself. It's just your mind playing tricks. After a couple hours of solitary hiking, I decided to take a short rest break near a small stream trickling through the woods. As I shed my heavy pack and sat on a fallen log, I suddenly noticed how preternaturally quiet the forest had become. The normal sounds of bird songs and small creatures rustling in the underbrush were entirely absent. A shiver ran down my spine at the uncanny stillness. Gulping some water, I forced myself to slow my breathing and get my bearings. I checked the topographical maps and satellite beacon in my pack. No new alerts or information. Frowning, I swept my gaze around the area again. Were those marks on that tree trunk across the stream? Scratch marks? I blinked and they were gone. The feeling of hidden eyes upon me intensified. Unsettled, I shouldered my pack and stood up stiffly, my instincts urging me onwards. Find the hiker and get out of these woods. As I resumed my trek, I couldn't shake the sensation of a malevolent presence dogging my footsteps just out of sight. I quickened my pace as dark fingers of dread curled around my pounding heart. As the faint trail dwindled to nearly nothing, I relied on my map and compass to navigate the dense thickets of underbrush. The unnatural hush of the forest grew more oppressive with each passing hour, pressing in on me from all sides. Stopping briefly to reorient myself, I crouched down and examined the damp ground, and froze. There in the mud were a set of large tracks unlike anything I'd seen before, too large and oddly shaped to be bear or wolf prints. The unidentifiable tracks seemed to shamble forward on 2 feet, with long, raking claw marks scoring the earth. Ice water trickled through my veins as I slowly stood up, my heart thudding against my ribs. What the hell could have made these? I thought of the missing hiker and bile rose in my throat. Swallowing hard, I unslung the rifle from my shoulder and held it tightly in sweaty palms as I warily followed the eerie tracks. After a half-mile, I stumbled into a small clearing and pulled up short. A lean, weather-beaten man in faded flannel stood on the other side, regarding me with piercing dark eyes. He looked to be in his 60s, with long gray hair and a lined face. I'd met a few of the local indigenous people who still lived around the edges of the vast park, but I'd never seen this man before. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Ranger," he said in a raspy voice, his eyes boring into mine. "These woods aren't safe, especially not now." "Why? What do you mean?" I asked, my mouth dry. The man glanced around the clearing, then took a step closer to me, lowering his voice to a whisper. "There's something out here, something old and evil. It can look like anything it wants, mimic anything in nature, and it's hungry." A cold sweat beaded on my forehead as a shaky breath escaped my lungs. The man's words in the uncanny stillness of the forest were deeply unsettling. "Get out while you still can," he warned. Then, without another word, the old man turned and melted back into the woods, disappearing between one blink and the next. Goosebumps rippled across my flesh as I stared at where he had been standing a moment before. My thoughts whirled chaotically, fear's icy fingers squeezing my chest. A flicker of movement in the dim space between the trees caught my eye. Something pale and vaguely human-shaped darted between the trunks a dozen yards away, there and gone in an instant, almost more sensed than seen. A jolt of pure terror electrified my nerves. My breath escaped in sharp pants as I gripped my rifle and stared wide-eyed into the dense foliage, straining to catch another glimpse of the thing stalking me. But the forest was still and silent, not so much as a leaf stirring. Even so, I couldn't shake the insidious feeling of being watched by sly, predatory eyes, of no longer being alone in the vast wilderness. Heart pounding, I turned and crashed back the way I'd come, branches whipping my face as I fled through the shadowy woods. I had to get out of here, had to escape this nightmarish landscape where nothing was as it seemed. And I still had a missing hiker to find before it was too late. Late afternoon light filtered weakly through the thinning trees as I staggered to a halt, dripping with sweat and my chest heaving from exertion. I was hopelessly lost. My compass spun uselessly, the needle drifting without apparent cause. My map was a meaningless scrawl of lines that bore no correlation to the unnatural terrain engulfing me. The sun continued to sink toward the obscured horizon, shadows growing long and strange around me. The temperature dropped precipitously and my breath plumed in the air. I dug through my pack for my headlamp with shaking fingers, the darkness pressing hungrily in on all sides. Just as full night fell, a blood-curdling scream rang out nearby, aborting with gruesome urgency. I spun in a circle, headlamp cutting a feeble swath through the murk as I tried to pinpoint the source. Another scream ripped through the air, trailing off into an agonized gurgle. It sounded like a woman or a child in horrible pain. "Hello? I'm a ranger. I'm here to help," I called out, my voice cracking. Silence fell like an axe blow. Skin crawling, I strained my ears. A twig snapped behind me and I whirled, rifle leaping to my shoulder. Two eyes glowed in the darkness between the trees, too far apart and too high up to belong to any animal. As I watched in paralyzing horror, a pale shape detached itself from the shadows, man-like but wrong, moving with a sick, boneless fluidity. "Help me," it mewled, vocal cords straining to mimic human speech. With dawning terror, I realized it was mimicking the hiker's voice from a voicemail his wife had played for me. My finger convulsed around the rifle's trigger, The shot crashed through the night and the hideous thing tittered and scuttled backwards, disappearing as if it had never been. Shaking like a leaf, I retreated to a small hollow ringed by tumbled boulders, as defensible a spot as I was likely to find. There I discovered a ragged backpack wedged under a rock ledge. With sinking dread, I recognized it as belonging to the missing hiker. Inside was a torn, blood-stained jacket. Something had ripped into his flesh with savage force, leaving stringy goblets dangling. I clapped a hand over my mouth as my stomach heaved. What had that thing done to him? Nearly whimpering with terror, I arranged my bedroll within the meager shelter of the boulders, clutching my rifle as I tried to calm my galloping heart. It was going to be a very long night. Curled on my thin bedroll, I lay rigid and sleepless as the longest night of my life crept by with infinite slowness. The absolute darkness beyond the feeble glow of my headlamp felt as thick and suffocating as black velvet. My ears strained the silence for any sound, anything to warn of the approach of the hungry thing haunting the forest. Dry leaves crackled, circling my little hollow with predatory intent. A stick snapped right behind my head and I yelped, rolling over and scrabbling for my gun. The night pressed down, watchful and malicious. "I know you're there," I whispered hoarsely. A wheezing chuckle sounded just outside the jumbled rocks sheltering me, a parody of human laughter. I trained my rifle on the gap with trembling hands. Then, in the distance, another scream rang out, this one the same as that awful mimic of the missing hiker. I slapped my palms over my ears, nearly screaming myself, as the thing circled and shouted in its horrible stolen voices. When I dared uncover my ears, I was greeted by a smug, watchful silence. Realization crashed over me. While I cowered in terror, that creature had been tampering with my supplies. Half my food was missing, my water bottles emptied and strewn about. At that moment, from mere inches behind my head, the thing spoke again in a perfect imitation of the old man I'd met in the woods. "Ranger," it whispered slyly. I spun around wildly, but there was only darkness and the mocking echo of that voice. Sobs clawed at my throat as I buried my face in my arms, rifle clutched against my heaving chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, madly wishing I would wake up safe at home in my bed. But the night's horrors continued unabated. Again and again the creature returned to torment me, sometimes circling with cracking footfalls for hours, sometimes whispering in the voices of my loved ones, horribly violated by its inhuman vocal cords. I could only cower in a near catatonic state, sanity fraying, praying for the night to end and too terrified to risk sleep. But deep in my marrow, I knew the coming of dawn would bring no salvation from the despicable thing that had fixed its cruel gaze upon me. As the first gray light of dawn seeped over the treetops, I was already stumbling through the brush in a near panic, fleeing the sight of my night-long torment. Rational thought had deserted me entirely, replaced by pure animal instinct screaming at me to escape the hideous thing that had toyed with me all through the endless night. Crashing through the underbrush, heedless of direction, I fled headlong into the misty woods. Low-hanging branches slapped my face and icy dew soaked through my pants as I ran. My labored breathing rasped harshly in my ears, almost drowning out the sounds of pursuit that seemed to dog my every step. I hadn't gone a quarter mile before I was forced to stop, bending double with my hands braced on my knees as I dragged burning air into my lungs. In the stillness, I suddenly heard a wet, tearing, smacking sound that turned my stomach. It sounded obscenely like something feeding messily. Slowly I raised my head, pulse thudding in my ears. There, mere yards away, crouched a ghastly thing like a skinned man, crimson and glistening. As I watched in struck horror, the creature rose to a hunched bipedal stance, its form shifting and flowing like wax. Pale flesh spread to cover the exposed musculature, darkening to a familiar flannel. I couldn't choke back a strangled sound as I found myself staring into the terribly transformed face of the old man from the woods. His features twisted into a razored parody of a smile. "Looks like it's feeding time, Ranger," it rasped in his voice, vocal cords straining. Then it lunged at me and I turned to run with a scream lodged in my throat. I ran as I had never run before, expecting with every step to feel skinless hands close around my neck, steaming breath on my nape. The creature followed, its footfall sometimes two-legged, sometimes four-legged, sometimes dozens of skittering insectile appendages. I caught glimpses of it flowing alongside me between the trees, shifting through grotesque forms with dizzying speed. A deer with an inverted skull, an emaciated bear with blood-matted fur, a spindly hominid with inhumanly long arms. At last strength deserted my trembling legs entirely, and I collapsed against the bole of an enormous spruce, retching. The creature flowed out of the woods in front of me, a towering column of nightmarish shapes. "No more running," it breathed, a forked tongue licking eyeless sockets. That hideous face passed through a dozen configurations, human, animal, things I couldn't begin to describe. Its body shivered and split, reforming into a mass of writhing gray-pink tentacles. I closed my eyes as those seeking tendrils caressed my face almost gently, hot breath wafting over me. So this was how it would end. Then, just another victim of the insatiable entity that had stalked these woods for generations. But as I braced myself for a killing stroke, the creature suddenly reared back with a spitting hiss. My eyes flew open, and I sucked in a shocked breath. There, mere feet away, stood an ancient log cabin, hardly more than a weathered shell. Heart thudding painfully against my ribs, I stared at the dilapidated cabin standing silent sentry in the clearing, its sagging frame draped with moss and creepers. Turning back to the nameless horror looming over me, I braced for its attack, but none came. The creature swayed and huffed, its shape flickering through a seething mass of forms as if unable to settle. But it made no move to close the distance between us, some invisible barrier holding it at bay. Hardly daring to breathe, I took one trembling step backwards, then another, until my shoulders hit the decaying wood of the cabin wall. The thing gnashed its needle teeth but didn't pursue me, only glared with red-rimmed eyes full of malevolent hunger. With a choked sob of relief, I wrenched open the crooked cabin door and flung myself inside, slamming it closed behind me. Hands shaking, I rammed the bolt home and sagged against the warped planks. In the wan light seeping through gaps in the walls, I could make out a one-room interior thick with dust and detritus, and scattered all over, the moldering belongings of the creature's previous victims stretching back decades. With growing nausea, I sifted through the tragic leavings of lives cut short. A child's teddy bear, a woman's locket, a man's cracked eyeglasses. How many had that thing devoured out here in the lonely wilds? Among the grim relics I found a battered leather journal, its pages all but disintegrated. Hands shaking, I carefully teased it open. The cramped, uneven writing spoke of dark legends and older-than-old tales passed down by the native tribes of a skinwalker that had once been a man of their people, a man who through twisted rituals and corrupt bargains had transformed himself into an undying thing, neither human nor animal, but an unholy fusion, always hungry for the warmth of living flesh to nourish its unclean form. Countless generations ago it had been trapped in the deep woods, unable to enter dwellings uninvited, but still it stalked and fed, growing stronger with each life it claimed. One day the elders whispered, it would be powerful enough to walk among men again, an insatiable predator wearing 1,000 faces. Bile rose in my throat as with dawning horror I realized the full truth. I hadn't been searching for the missing hiker. That sad soul had been taken and consumed long before I ever set foot in these accursed woods. No. The skinwalker had lured me here to make me its next meal, and now I was trapped in the last frail shelter, the stolen lives of its victims my only company, while the evil thing prowled the clearing in a tireless hunger, waiting for me to emerge, waiting to swallow me into its changeling body to be digested over an eternity. The cabin walls groaned as if in reproach, and I hugged my rifle numbly. The dusty glass eyes of the teddy. For hours I huddled on the rough plank floor of the cabin, paralyzed by terror as the skinwalker circled the ramshackle structure. It never stopped moving, flickering from form to form in a ceaseless, nauseating dance. Now a ravening bear, now an emaciated deer, now a grotesque man-like shape with horns and hooves and writhing tentacles. The cabin door rattled and shook as the creature tested it again and again, determined to get to its prize within. Each time I cringed back against the far wall, whimpering, certain the ancient bolt was about to give way. But the door held, and the skinwalker could not enter without an invitation, according to the natives' faded writings. I clutched my rifle in white-knuckled hands, my fingers aching on the icy steel. Not that it would do me much good against such a mutable, unholy thing. Daylight faded into another ebon night, and still the creature stalked the clearing with inexhaustible hunger. It began to call out to me, its voice slipping from one familiar timbre to another in a sinister sing-song. Come out, tasty ranger," it mewled in the missing hiker's voice, then the old native man's, then Oh God, help me, my wife's. I'm cold and lonely. Let me come inside and get warm. Tears rolled down my face as I shook my head frantically, hands clamped over my ears. But still its honey-sweet poison seeped into my mind, insidious tendrils hooking into my exhausted brain. The temptation to open the door, to make the torment stop, grew with each passing minute. I'm so hungry, it crooned in a child's piping tones. Feed me, a woman's husky contralto. I'll make you feel so good if you just open up. On and on it went, hours of coaxing and cajoling in a queasy kaleidoscope of voices, its words writhing through my mind like maggots. My sanity stretched thinner and thinner, until I was sure it would snap at any moment. And then, sometime in the icy pit of the night, the skinwalker stopped its pacing. Silence flooded the clearing, thick and absolute. I held my breath, straining my ears. Long minutes ticked by. Then a gentle tap sounded at the window, and I raised my head from my knees to see a face peering in at me. My face, smiling with obscene hunger, eyes nothing but blank black pits. As I watched in struck horror, my doppelganger raised a skinless hand and crooked a finger at me. An anguished moan slipped from my cracked lips as the creature wearing my face cocked its head and spoke, vocal cords straining to shape words never meant for a human tongue. "Let me in," it said sweetly in my own voice. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." Rising to my knees, I snatched up my rifle and aimed it at the twisted mirror of my face with shaking hands. The butt slammed into my shoulder once, twice, 3 times. The window exploded in a crystalline spray of shards, and the skinwalker laughed. A skittering, hissing thing that turned my bowels to ice water as it lunged through the jagged opening, still wearing my face like an ill-fitting mask. "Yes," it crowed as its jaws gaped inhumanly wide. "Your flesh, your soul." The rifle stock slammed into the side of its head, sending it reeling back. Teeth bared in a snarl, I chambered another round and fired point blank into the center of its chest. The thing shrieked, black ichor spraying as the bullet tore through its chest. It hit the floor and thrashed, flesh flowing and squirming as it contorted into 100 nightmare shapes. Still I fired, again and again, screaming my rage and terror, until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Chest heaving, I stared down at the twitching mass of pulsing flesh and chitin and far too many grasping limbs. A gurgling hiss issued from its shredded throat as one slitted feline eye glared balefully up at me. "Even if you kill this body," it wheezed, "you cannot destroy me, foolish mortal. I'll just make another, and another, until the end of time. You will never be free." With an inarticulate howl of fury, I snatched up the can of kerosene from the cabin's corner. I upended it over the writhing abomination, the unclean thing that had fed on the fear and suffering of countless victims for far too long. The creature shrilled in agony as I flicked open my Zippo and tossed it onto the spreading pool of fuel. Fire leapt up with a whoosh, putrid smoke filling the air. I stumbled back from the conflagration filling the cabin, one arm flung across my face. Over the crackle of flames I heard a long, savage scream, rising to an unbearable crescendo before cutting off abruptly. And then, blessed silence. The skinwalker's warped body was nothing more than greasy ash, its malignant essence banished to whatever dark realm had first spawned it. It was over, but even as I burst out of the burning cabin into the clean, cold night, I knew that I would never be the same. The horrible truths I had learned, the impossible things I had seen and heard and felt, could never be forgotten. The skinwalker's final words rang in my mind like a vile prophecy. I had destroyed one manifestation of it, yes, but was its foul quintessence truly gone from this world? Or would it one day return, wearing a new face, to stalk the lonely places once more? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I knew was that I had to get out of these woods, away from the scene of such unspeakable horror. And so I ran, as the hungry flames consumed the cabin and its grim secrets behind me, ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed and the sheer effort of movement blessedly drowned out all thought. At last I staggered out of the tree line at the edge of the highway where I'd started this ill-fated expedition a lifetime ago. In a daze, I waved down a passing pickup truck, barely hearing the driver's startled exclamation at my ragged, soot-streaked appearance. The man loaded me into the cab without question, pale eyes full of unspoken understanding. He'd grown up hearing the same whispered legends, no doubt. We didn't talk beyond his murmured assurance that he'd get me to a hospital. I huddled against the door, shivering, as the truck bumped over the rutted road. The first pale fingers of dawn crept over the jagged horizon, light as cold and colorless as my thoughts. It was over, I told myself. I had won. I had survived. So why did I feel so far from victorious? Why even now could I still feel phantom eyes boring into my back, avid and famished, and in the pit of my stomach the unshakable certainty hardened that this wasn't the end. The skinwalker would return one day, in another form, to hunt again. It was inevitable as the turning of the seasons, the shape of ancient nightmares. I had only brought myself a brief reprieve, bought myself a handful of years, before the cycle began anew. The thing in the woods would be back, and it would remember me. I could only hope that next time I would be ready to face it once more. The truck sped away down the lonely highway, the endless forest an indifferent witness, hiding its dark truths behind a veil of mist. In the shadows between the trees, something hungry watched us go and waited for its chance to feed again.